The Cotton Club, 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, Harlem, New York. December 4th, 1929. The most famous nightclub in America, where Duke Ellington's orchestra played 7 nights a week, where Cab Calloway invented the word Heidi-ho, where Josephine Baker danced, Ethel Waters sang, and Bill Bojangles Robinson tapped his way into history. 1,000 white faces in evening wear, champagne glasses catching the spotlight, cigarette smoke thick enough to cut with a knife. Not one black customer. Wall-to-wall segregation enforced by armed bouncers at the door. Whites only. In Harlem. In the heart of Black America's cultural capital. On stage, brilliance. In the audience, apartheid. And in the back office, Oni Madden, Irish bootlegger, convicted murderer, paroled in 1923 after serving 8 years for killing a man in a street fight, owner of the Cotton Club, the most profitable nightclub in North America. On this December night in 1929, he'll count $8,000 in revenue. That's $140,000 in today's money. From one night. Where's the money coming from? Bootleg whiskey, $3 a shot. Cover charge, $5 per person. Minimum spend, $15 per table. Slot machines in the basement. And the music? The music is just the bait. Duke Ellington earns $750 a week, the highest paid black band leader in America. Madden earns that much before midnight. But here's what they don't show you in the movies. 3 blocks away, another kind of nightclub. No famous name, no white audiences. Just a brownstone apartment, 2nd floor, where 100 black Harlemites are packed shoulder to shoulder, dancing to a piano player who's improvising because he's been playing for 4 hours straight and ran out of songs 2 hours ago. This is a rent party. And the woman who lives here, she's collected $237 tonight. 50 cents admission, 25 cents per drink, and a tip jar by the piano. That's more money than she makes in 6 weeks working as a domestic servant for a white family downtown. She'll pay her rent tomorrow. $40. The rest? She'll save it, because next month the same thing happens all over again. Now, 4 blocks north. A storefront with blacked out windows. No sign. You knock 3 times. A slot opens. Someone looks you over. And if they like what they see, you're in. Inside, 30 men and women huddled around a table. A man in a vest is pulling numbers from a canvas bag. Someone shouts, 72! A woman screams, clutches a ticket, and starts crying. She just won $300. She bet 50 cents. That's a 600 to 1 payout. This is a policy bank. Numbers gambling. The Harlem Lottery. And the man running it? Casper Holstein. Born in the Virgin Islands, arrived in New York in 1913 with $6 in his pocket. Tonight, December 4th, 1929, his 30 policy banks across Harlem will collect $60,000 in bets. He'll pay out $20,000 in winnings. The rest, $40,000 in one day. That's $800,000 in today's money. Per week, $4 million. Per year, $200 million. And what does he do with it? He funds the Harlem Renaissance. Last month, he gave Langston Hughes $1,000 so he could quit his busboy job and write poetry full-time. 2 months ago, he paid for Zora Neale Hurston's research trip to the South. He bankrolls black theater productions, sponsors literary contests, and keeps Opportunity magazine alive. The greatest artistic movement in American history, funded by illegal gambling. And finally, one more scene. Convent Avenue, the most exclusive street in Harlem. A 5-story townhouse that costs $200,000. The owner is inside, throwing a party. Champagne imported from France. Live jazz quartet in the corner. 50 guests, a mix of artists and criminals. Langston Hughes is talking to Stephanie St. Clair, the only woman in New York who runs her own policy operation. Zora Neale Hurston is laughing with a man who just got out of prison for shooting a rival numbers banker. And in the center of it all, the host, Alelia Walker, daughter of Madam C.J. Walker, the first black woman millionaire in America. She inherited $2 million when her mother died in 1919. Tonight, this party will cost $10,000. 4 scenes. one night, one neighborhood, December 4th, 1929. They said black culture was primitive, savage, not art, just noise. They said jazz was the devil's music, that black people couldn't create anything America would pay to see. They said Harlem was a slum, a ghetto, a place where nothing good could ever grow. They were catastrophically wrong. But here's what they don't teach you in school, what they leave out of the documentaries, what gets erased from the history books. The greatest artistic movement in American history was funded by bootleggers, built by gangsters, and controlled by the same criminal underworld that made Prohibition-era New York the most dangerous city in America. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't just Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington. It was Madden and Casper Holstein. It was rent parties where musicians got paid in bootleg gin and whatever was left in the tip jar. It was policy banks that extracted millions from the poorest black neighborhood in America and funneled just enough back to keep the artists alive. This is the story of how crime and culture became inseparable, how segregation created an economic ecosystem where the only people willing to invest in black art were criminals, because they were the only ones with money the white establishment couldn't control. How the Cotton Club and the policy racket and the rent party circuit formed a triangle that created jazz, birthed the Lindy Hop, and gave America its only original art form. This is the story of the Harlem Renaissance underworld, and it starts 20 years earlier, when Harlem wasn't black at all. Harlem, Manhattan. If you walked down Lenox Avenue that year, you'd see German bakeries, Irish saloons, Italian grocery stores, and Jewish tailors. Middle class, immigrant, white, black people. They lived downtown in a neighborhood called the Tenderloin, around 30th Street. Harlem was where white people moved to escape them. The neighborhood had been built for wealthy white families in the 1880s. Grand brownstones, wide boulevards, tree-lined streets. But by 1910, it was in trouble. Real estate developers had overbuilt. Too many apartments, not enough tenants. Property values were collapsing. And into that crisis walked a black real estate agent named Philip Payton. Payton saw an opportunity. White landlords couldn't fill their buildings. Black families downtown were desperate for better housing, crammed into tenements where tuberculosis killed thousands every year. So Payton made a pitch. Rent to black tenants. They'll pay more than white tenants because they have no other options. And they'll take care of the properties because they're grateful to be there. The white landlords were horrified. Rent to black people in Harlem, but they were also broke, and broke beats racist. Payton bought his first building in 1904. By 1910, he controlled 200 properties. The white residents fought back. They formed neighborhood associations, tried to establish restrictive covenants, even offered to buy out black tenants just to make them leave. It didn't work, because something bigger was coming, something no neighborhood association could stop: the Great Migration. Between 1910 and 1920, 500,000 black people left the South and moved north. They were fleeing Jim Crow, fleeing sharecropping, fleeing lynching. World War I created a labor shortage in northern factories. Steel mills, meatpacking plants, automobile factories, they needed workers. And for the first time in American history, they were willing to hire black people. Harlem became the destination. In 1910, the neighborhood was 10% black, 14,000 people. By 1920, 73% black, 118,000 people. In a single decade, an entire community displaced, rebuilt, and reinvented itself. The largest internal migration in American history, and Harlem was ground zero. But here's what that actually looked like on the ground. It wasn't orderly. It wasn't planned. It was chaos. Families arrived with everything they owned in a single suitcase. They had no jobs, no connections, no money. Landlords saw opportunity. A white family paid $30 a month for a 3-bedroom apartment. A black family, $60 for the same apartment. And if you complained, there were 10 families behind you willing to pay $70. So black families adapted. 3 families in one apartment. Grandparents, parents, and children sleeping in shifts. Living rooms converted to bedrooms. Kitchens used 24 hours a day. And still, they couldn't make rent. $60 a month when you're earning $15 a week. The math doesn't work. And that's where the rent party was born. The rent party, the most important cultural institution in Harlem's history. And it started as an act of desperation. You're 3 weeks late on rent, landlord's threatening eviction, and you have no options. So you do this. Print up 100 cards on cheap paper. Saturday night fish fry, music, dancing, refreshments, 25 cents admission. Bring your friends. You nail them to telephone poles, hand them out on street corners, pass them around church on Sunday. Saturday night comes. You move the furniture against the walls. You set up a table with fried fish and potato salad. You put out bottles of bootleg gin. This is 1920. Prohibition just started. Liquor's illegal, but everyone's drinking, and you hire a piano player. $5 for the night. By midnight, 80 people crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment. Everyone paid their quarter. That's $20. Gin sales? $30. Food? $20 more. You've made $70 in one night. You pay the piano player $5. You pay back the neighbor who lent you money for fish and liquor, and you've cleared $50. Enough for rent, plus a little extra. And here's the thing. The music was incredible. Because rent parties needed music that could last 6 hours minimum, and one piano player couldn't just replay the same songs all night. People would leave. So they improvised. They invented. They took ragtime and started adding syncopation, adding blues notes, adding complex rhythms nobody had heard before. They called it stride piano. James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion Smith, Fats Waller. These weren't famous musicians yet. They were 20-year-olds getting paid $5 to play rent parties 6 nights a week. Fats, Waller would tell the story later. In 1920, he was the organist at Abyssinian Baptist Church. $15 a week. Respectable job. His father was proud. Then he played his first rent party. Made $5 for 4 hours of work. Then someone handed him a bottle of gin and asked if he could play another party the next night. Within a month, he quit the church. Within a year, he was playing 7 rent parties a week. $35. More than double his church salary. And the music? The music he was creating at those rent parties, improvising at 2 a.m. for drunk dancers who just wanted the beat to keep going? That became jazz. By 1922, there were 2,000 rent parties every weekend in Harlem. 2,000. Do the math. 2,000 parties, 80 people per party. That's 160,000 people participating in an underground economy that was completely off the books, invisible to the government, and generating something new. Not just the music, the whole culture, the way people dressed, the dances they invented, the slang they created. Rent parties were incubators. But they were also illegal. Serving alcohol without a license. Operating an unlicensed business. Fire code violations. 80 people in an apartment built for 5. The NYPD should have shut them down instantly. They didn't, because someone was paying the cops to look the other way. Enter the bootleggers. Prohibition created the modern American gangster. Before 1920, organized crime was small-scale, protection rackets, gambling, prostitution. After January 1920, when the 18th Amendment made alcohol illegal nationwide, suddenly every American who wanted a drink was a criminal, and the people supplying those drinks became millionaires overnight. In Harlem, that meant the Irish and Italian mobs. Oni Madden controlled bootleg distribution in Upper Manhattan. He owned breweries in New Jersey, distilleries in the Bronx, and a fleet of trucks that delivered liquor to speakeasies across the city. And Harlem? Harlem was his most profitable market. Because rent parties needed liquor, and nobody could afford to buy from legitimate sources, there were no legitimate sources. So Madden made a deal. He'd supply the liquor at wholesale prices. The rent party hosts would sell it at retail. He'd take a cut. And in exchange, he'd pay the cops to leave everyone alone. $20 a week to the beat cop. $100 a month to the precinct captain. The economics worked. A bottle of gin cost Madden $3 to produce. he sold it to rent party hosts for $8. They sold drinks for 25 cents each, 30 drinks per bottle, $7.50 in revenue. Everyone made money. The cops got paid, and Harlem kept partying. But Madden saw something bigger. He looked at Harlem in 1922 and realized, this neighborhood is generating millions in off-the-books economic activity. Rent parties, underground nightclubs, illegal gambling. And the people running it are disorganized, independent, vulnerable. So he started buying. Not violently, not yet, just buying. He'd approach a rent party host who'd been arrested too many times, offer to pay their legal fees in exchange for running their parties. He'd find a corner speakeasy doing good business, offer the owner cash to become a partner. By 1923, Oni Madden controlled 30 properties in Harlem. Not directly. He used black front men because a white gangster owning property in Harlem would attract attention. But he owned them, and he was converting them. No more living rooms with a piano. Now they were actual nightclubs. 30 seats, a small stage, a bar, a bouncer at the door. And that's when he heard about a place on 142nd Street that was for sale. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the Cotton Club, before Oni Madden reshaped Harlem nightlife into a commodity for white consumption, there was a different model. A black-owned model. And it started with a man named Baron Wilkins. Before the rent parties, before Prohibition, before the Cotton Club, there was Baron Wilkins. And if you want to understand how Harlem's cultural renaissance got funded, you start with him. Baron Wilkins wasn't a gangster. He was a businessman. Born in 1872, worked as a porter, saved his money, and in 1910 opened the Exclusive Club on West 35th Street. Not Harlem yet. This was before the Great Migration. The Exclusive Club catered to black middle-class professionals, doctors, lawyers, Pullman porters who made good money, live ragtime music, respectable atmosphere, no gambling, no prostitution. Wilkins charged $1 cover, served food and non-alcoholic drinks, and by 1915 was making $60,000 a year. That's $1.8 million in today's money. What Wilkins proved was simple. Black culture could be profitable if you created the right environment. And when Harlem started turning black after 1915, he moved uptown and opened a bigger club on 134th Street. Same model. Respectable, middle class, legal. And he made a fortune. But the man who really understood the economics of Harlem wasn't Baron Wilkins. It was Casper Holstein. Casper Holstein, born in the Danish Virgin Islands in 1877. His mother was a former slave. His father unknown. The Virgin Islands in the 1890s were economically dead. No industry, no jobs, no future. In 1894, at age 17, Holstein worked his way onto a merchant ship as a deckhand. 3 years later, he jumped ship in New York City. He worked every job you could work as a black immigrant in turn-of-the-century New York. Dock worker, porter, janitor, delivery man. By 1912, he'd saved enough to rent an apartment in Harlem, which was just starting to turn black. He got a job as a porter at a boarding house. And that's where he learned about policy gambling. Policy, the numbers racket, the Harlem lottery. It worked like this. You bet on a 3-digit number between 000 and 999. Every day, a winning number was drawn. If your number hit, you won 600 times your bet. So a nickel bet paid $3. A dollar bet paid $600. The game wasn't new. It had been brought to New York by Cuban immigrants in the 1890s, where it was called bolita. By 1910, there were small policy operations in black neighborhoods across the city. But they were disorganized. Mom-and-pop operations run out of barbershops and grocery stores. Holstein saw what everyone else missed. He saw that policy was the perfect business for Harlem. Here's why. First, the bets were tiny. A nickel, a dime, a quarter. Poor people could afford it. And in a neighborhood where 70% of families couldn't make rent without taking on debt, people were desperate for a miracle. Policy sold hope. Second, the overhead was almost nothing. You didn't need a location, just a guy walking around collecting bets and a back room somewhere to count the money. No inventory, no equipment, no rent. Third, and this is the key, the math was rigged in your favor. The true odds of hitting a 3-digit number? 1 in 1,000. But policy only paid 600 to 1. That means for every $1,000 in bets collected, the house paid out 600 in winnings and kept 400. A 40% profit margin, guaranteed. Holstein started small. In 1913, he convinced the owner of the boarding house where he worked to let him run a policy bank out of the basement. He borrowed $50 for the first day's payouts in case someone won. He hired 2 runners, guys who walked around the neighborhood taking bets, and he started distributing slips of paper with his name on them. Holstein's number, fair play guaranteed. The first month, he collected $200 in bets. He paid out $120 in winnings. Profit, $80. Not bad for a side hustle. But Holstein understood something crucial: trust. Other policy operations were corrupt. They'd announce fake numbers, refuse to pay out winners, disappear with the money. Holstein did the opposite. He always paid. He published the winning numbers in the local newspaper. He used the stock market closing numbers to determine winners. Totally transparent. Couldn't be rigged. Within 2 years, he was running 5 policy banks. By 1920, he had 30. And the money? By 1925, Casper Holstein was collecting $60,000 per week in policy bets. That's $4 million per year in 1925 dollars. In today's money, $140 million per year. He became the richest black man in Harlem. They called him the Bolito King. He wore custom suits, drove a Packard limousine, lived in a townhouse on 139th Street. He owned nightclubs, invested in real estate, and employed 300 people directly, another 2,000 indirectly as runners and collectors. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Holstein didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a businessman operating outside white law because white law was designed to exclude him. And he genuinely believed that his money should flow back to the black community. In 1926, he established the Holstein Prize, a $1,000 annual award for black literature. That's $18,000 in today's money. Langston Hughes won it in 1926 for his poem, The Weary Blues. That prize allowed Hughes to quit his job as a busboy and write full-time. Holstein funded Opportunity magazine, the leading journal of black arts and letters. He gave money to theater companies, sponsored art exhibitions, and paid rent for writers who were struggling. Zora Neale Hurston's research trip to the South in 1927, where she collected the folktales that became Mules and Men, funded by Casper Holstein. He justified it this way: white people won't invest in our culture. Fine, I'll make my money from our people and give it back to our artists. Let them call me a criminal. History will call me a patron. And for a brief moment, from about 1924 to 1928, it looked like he might be right. The Harlem Renaissance was exploding. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen. They were all publishing, all getting national attention. And behind every one of them was Holstein's money, or someone like him. But there was a moral problem nobody wanted to talk about. The money funding the Renaissance was coming from the pockets of the poorest people in Harlem. People who couldn't afford food were betting their last nickel on policy. People were going into debt to play. And Holstein knew it. He knew his business was predatory. He told a reporter in 1927, "People say I'm exploiting the community. Maybe, but I'm also employing 300 people who couldn't get jobs anywhere else. I'm paying better than any white employer would. And I'm putting money back into black culture. Show me a white businessman who's doing that." The reporter didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, Holstein was right. Without policy money, the Harlem Renaissance would have looked very different. Langston Hughes might have stayed a busboy. Zora Neale Hurston might have never finished college. Black theater companies would have folded. But also, families were skipping meals to play policy. Children were going without shoes because their parents were chasing a 600 to 1 payout. And Holstein? He was driving a Packard. By 1928, Casper Holstein was running the most sophisticated criminal operation in Harlem. 30 policy banks, each one processing 2,000 bets per day. A network of runners covering every block from 110th Street to 155th. Collectors who picked up the money 3 times daily, and an accounting system sophisticated enough that Holstein could tell you, at any moment, exactly how much he owed in payouts and how much profit he'd make. He was also politically connected. He paid Tammany Hall $5,000 a month for protection. In exchange, the police left him alone. When rivals tried to muscle in, the cops would conveniently raid their operations and leave Holstein untouched. He employed the community. Runners made $15 a week, more than most factory jobs paid black workers. Collectors made $25. Bank managers made $50. In a neighborhood with 50% unemployment, Holstein was the largest private employer, and he funded the Renaissance. But he also built the infrastructure that Dutch Schultz would later try to steal. And that war, the war between Holstein's independent black operation and the white mob's desire to control it, that war would define the 1930s, and it would end the Golden Age. But we're not there yet, because first, we need to understand what Holstein's money built. Not just the literary magazines and the poetry prizes, the nightlife, the clubs, the ecosystem where jazz went from rent party improvisation to America's music. And that story starts with a failed heavyweight champion and a converted boxing gym on 142nd Street. Prohibition begins. The 18th Amendment makes it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages anywhere in the United States. The law goes into effect on January 17, 1920. By January 18th, every speakeasy in New York is packed. Prohibition didn't stop drinking. It stopped legal drinking. And in that gap between law and reality, Harlem's nightlife exploded. Before Prohibition, Harlem had maybe 30 bars and saloons, all legal, all licensed. After Prohibition, 500 illegal speakeasies within 6 months. By 1925, 2,000. Not restaurants with liquor licenses. Underground clubs, basement operations, residential apartments converted into drinking establishments. And the rent party circuit became professionalized. It wasn't just neighbors helping neighbors anymore. It was a business. A woman named Lulu May operated 7 rent parties simultaneously in 1923, all in different apartments she rented specifically for that purpose. She'd hire 3 piano players per night, rotate them between locations, serve bootleg gin she bought wholesale from Madden's distributors, and clear $300 per weekend. That's $18,000 per year, more than a black doctor made. The musicians got paid, but they got more than money. They got an education, because rent parties were where jazz got invented in real time. James P. Johnson started playing rent parties in 1918. He was classically trained, could read music, had played in respectable venues. But at rent parties, nobody cared about classical technique. They wanted rhythm. They wanted dancing. So Johnson started experimenting. He took ragtime, the popular music of the 1910s, and made it faster, more percussive. He developed what became known as stride piano. The left hand playing bass notes on the first and third beats, chords on the second and fourth. The right hand improvising melodic lines on top. It was physically exhausting. Stride piano requires you to leap across the keyboard, covering 10 keys with your left hand, while your right hand is doing something completely different. But it sounded like a full band. One piano player could create the illusion of bass, drums, and horns all at once. And at a rent party where you couldn't afford to hire multiple musicians, that mattered. Willie the Lion Smith took it further. He added blues notes, complex harmonies, polyrhythms he'd learned from Caribbean immigrants in his neighborhood. By 1921, he was the highest paid rent party pianist in Harlem. $10 per night, sometimes $20 if the party was big enough. He'd play from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 8 hours straight, improvising the entire time, because if you played the same song twice, people would get bored and leave. And then there was Fats Waller. Born Thomas Wright Waller in 1904, son of a Baptist preacher. Learned piano at church, became the organist at Abyssinian Baptist Church at age 15. respectable job. His father was proud, and Fats hated every minute of it. He played his first rent party in 1920, age 16. Someone handed him a bottle of gin, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't playing hymns. He was improvising, making it up, and the crowd loved it. By the end of the night, he'd made $5, 1/3 of his weekly church salary. Someone asked if he could play again the next week. Within 6 months, Fats quit the church. His father disowned him. Fats didn't care. He was making $30 a week playing rent parties, more money than his father made as a trucker. And the music? The music was unlike anything America had heard. Fats Waller would later say, "Rent parties were my conservatory. I learned more playing 8 hours straight for drunk dancers than I ever learned in any music school. Because you had to keep them moving. If the energy dropped, people left. If people left, you didn't get paid. So you learned to read the room, adjust on the fly, invent new rhythms to keep them interested. That's jazz. Not playing what's written, playing what's needed." By 1923, the rent party circuit had produced a generation of musicians who were fundamentally different from their predecessors. They didn't read music, most of them. They played by ear. They improvised. They incorporated blues, ragtime, spirituals, Caribbean rhythms, and created something new. They called it jazz, though the name wouldn't stick for a few more years. And here's what made it revolutionary. It was black music, created by black musicians for black audiences, funded by black money. The white music industry had no access to it. No white producer could walk into a rent party and offer a record deal. No white club owner could book these musicians because they were playing illegally in residential apartments. It was the most authentically black cultural space in American history. And it couldn't last because white people heard about it and they wanted in. Downtown white socialites started slumming. That was the term, slumming. Rich white people from Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue would take cabs up to Harlem, show up at rent parties, stand in the back, and watch black people dance. They'd drink the bootleg gin, listen to the music, and leave feeling like they'd done something daring and exotic. The rent party hosts didn't mind. White money spent the same as black money, and white people tipped better. But it changed the atmosphere. It made the space self-conscious. Performers started playing to the white gaze, exaggerating the primitive elements because that's what white audiences wanted to see. And some musicians hated it. Willie the Lion Smith refused to play any party that advertised to white audiences. He'd say, "This is our music, our space. The moment we start performing it for them, it stops being ours." But Fats Waller, Fats didn't care. He'd take money from anyone. And in 1923, he got offered something bigger than rent party gigs. A downtown club wanted to hire him. Regular salary, every night. Not just weekends. The catch? He'd be playing for white audiences, and they wanted him to act a certain way. Smile more. Be entertaining. Play the happy Negro pianist. Fats took the gig. He needed the money. But something changed in him. His friends said he started drinking more, became bitter. In 1927, he wrote a song called "Ain't Misbehavin'." It became one of his most famous recordings. But if you listen to the lyrics, really listen, it's about selling out. Ain't misbehavin', I'm saving my love for you. He's promising to be good, to behave, to not cause trouble. For you, for the white audience, for the paycheck. And that tension between artistic authenticity and economic survival, that was the story of the Harlem Renaissance in miniature. Every artist faced it. Do you create for your community, or do you create for the people with money? Do you stay true to your vision, or do you give them what they want so you can eat? By 1925, the rent party circuit was still thriving, but it was changing. The purely community-based parties were being replaced by semi-professional operations. Entrepreneurs would rent commercial space, hire multiple musicians, charge higher admission, and market specifically to white slummers. These weren't rent parties anymore. They were nightclubs. Underground, unlicensed, illegal nightclubs. And that's when Oni Madden made his move. Because he'd been watching. He'd seen thousands of white people paying to experience black culture. He'd seen musicians getting paid $5, $10, $20 per night. And he'd done the math. If you could create a space that was legally safe for white audiences, that had top-tier black entertainment, that served alcohol openly because the police were paid off, and that charged premium prices because you had a monopoly on safety, you could make a fortune. In 1923, Jack Johnson's Club Deluxe went up for sale. Johnson was the first black heavyweight boxing champion, a cultural icon, and he'd opened the club in 1920 as a showcase for black talent. But he was a fighter, not a businessman. By 1923, he was losing $6,000 a month. The club was too expensive to maintain. The overhead was killing him, and he was going broke. Oney Madden bought it for $12,000, a steal. He renamed it the Cotton Club, and he implemented a policy that would define Harlem nightlife for the next decade. Black performers, white audiences only. Duke Ellington would arrive 4 years later. Cab Calloway, Ethel Waters, Bill Robinson, the greatest black entertainers in America, all performing for whites-only crowds in the heart of black Harlem, at a club owned by an Irish gangster who'd killed a man with his bare hands. And the money Madden made? He used it to buy more clubs, more properties, more control over Harlem's nightlife. By 1930, Oney Madden controlled 35 nightclubs in Harlem. Not all of them as famous as the Cotton Club, but all of them profitable. All of them extracting wealth from a neighborhood that was generating culture at a rate America had never seen. That culture, it was real. The music was revolutionary. The literature was groundbreaking. The art was transforming American aesthetics. But it was built on a foundation of bootleg gin, illegal gambling, and white money. And the artists caught in the middle had to make impossible choices. Langston Hughes wrote in 1926, "We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual, dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter." Beautiful words, radical words. But also, Langston Hughes was being funded by Casper Holstein's policy profits. And the magazines publishing his poems? They were advertising in white newspapers to attract white subscribers. And the book deals he'd eventually sign? With white publishers, for white audiences. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't happening in isolation. It was happening inside an economic system that required white approval and criminal funding to survive. And by 1928, that system was about to collapse. Because the Italian and Irish mobs wanted Harlem's money. All of it. And they were willing to kill for it. The golden age was almost over. But first, it would shine brighter than anyone thought possible. Jack Johnson's Club Deluxe, 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, 1920 to 1923. Jack Johnson was the most famous black man in America. First black heavyweight boxing champion. Defeated Jim Jeffries in 1910, the Great White Hope, and white America never forgave him. They convicted him on trumped-up charges under the Mann Act, transporting a white woman across state lines for immoral purposes. He fled to Europe, lived in exile for 7 years, came back in 1920, and opened his club as a symbol. They can't stop me from building something. The Club Deluxe was magnificent. 500 capacity, 2-tiered seating, a massive dance floor, full orchestra pit. Johnson hired the best musicians he could find, paid them well, and kept admission prices low so working-class black Harlemites could afford it. Mixed crowd, black and white, socialites and laborers. It was everything a nightclub should be. And it was hemorrhaging money. The overhead was catastrophic. Rent, $800 per month. Staff payroll, $3,000. Liquor costs, $2,000, and that's with bootleg prices. Johnson was taking in maybe $4,000 per month in revenue. He was losing $6,000 every single month. By 1923, he was $200,000 in debt. That's $3 million in today's money. He had no choice. He had to sell. Oney Madden had been waiting. He'd watched the Club Deluxe for 3 years, watched it fail, and he knew exactly why. Johnson was trying to run a luxury nightclub like it was a community center. Low prices, mixed crowds, no vice beyond the bootleg liquor. That model didn't work in Prohibition-era Harlem. You needed multiple revenue streams: alcohol, gambling, protection rackets, and you needed customers with money. White customers. Madden offered Johnson $12,000. It was insultingly low. The property alone was worth 5 times that. But Johnson was drowning. He took the deal. In June 1923, Oni Madden became the owner of the soon-to-be Cotton Club. First thing Madden did, fire all the staff. Second thing, install slot machines in the basement, roulette tables in the back rooms. Third thing, whites-only admission policy. Fourth thing, black performers only. Let me explain why that last part mattered. Madden wasn't trying to showcase black culture. He was creating a product for white consumers. Come to Harlem, safely. See authentic Negro entertainment. Experience the exotic, primitive, thrilling culture without any danger. The Cotton Club marketed itself as a safari. You, white customer from Park Avenue, can sit in safety and watch the savages perform. And it worked. It worked spectacularly. Opening night, September 1923, Madden charged $5 cover. That's $90 today. Minimum spend per table, $15. That's $270 today. For comparison, the average Harlem family earned $20 per week. A single table at the Cotton Club cost 3/4 of what a black family lived on for 7 days. But white Manhattan showed up. Society columnists, Broadway producers, bootleggers, Wall Street traders, celebrities. They packed the club. 500 people, every table full. By midnight, Madden had grossed $8,000 one night. And the costs? Payroll, $200. Liquor, $300. Rent, $27. Monthly rent divided by 30. Profit, $7,500. In one night. Madden knew he'd struck gold, but he also knew the entertainment had to be spectacular, because the Cotton Club's real competition wasn't other nightclubs. It was the rent parties, the underground spots where white slummers could have authentic experiences. Madden needed to make the Cotton Club so good, so professional, so safe, that white audiences would pay premium prices instead of going underground. So he invested. He brought in professional choreographers, built elaborate stage sets, jungle scenes with palm trees and fake elephants, hired costume designers, created a full review format, dancers, singers, comedians, all scripted, all timed perfectly. 2 shows per night, 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. And he paid his performers well, by nightclub standards. The Cotton Club chorus girls made $50 per week. That's double what they'd make at a whites-only Broadway theater. Lead singers made $75 to $100. Musicians made even more. Madden understood. If you wanted the best black talent, you had to pay for it. But there were conditions. Conditions nobody talked about publicly. First, you performed what white audiences wanted to see. Jungle music, primitive rhythms, exotic dances, costumes that were deliberately sexualized, grass skirts, bare midriffs, feathers. The Cotton Club sold a fantasy of Africa that had nothing to do with Africa and everything to do with white stereotypes of black sexuality and savagery. Second, you never acknowledged the segregation. You smiled, you performed, you entertained, and after the show, you left through the back door, because the Cotton Club's dining room, its bar, its tables, those were for whites only. The performers weren't allowed to sit down as customers. Ever. Third, you signed an exclusivity contract. Once you worked for the Cotton Club, you couldn't work anywhere else in Harlem without Madden's permission. He owned you. For some performers, it was worth it. Steady pay, professional environment, national exposure. The Cotton Club broadcasts its shows on CBS radio starting in 1927. You perform at the Cotton Club. Suddenly you're famous coast to coast. For others, it was artistic death, playing to white expectations, reinforcing stereotypes, selling out your culture for a paycheck. In 1924, The Cotton Club was still finding its footing. Madden cycled through bandleaders, trying to find the right sound. And then, in December 1927, everything changed. Because Duke Ellington arrived. Edward Kennedy Ellington, born in Washington, D.C., 1899. Middle-class black family, his father worked as a butler in the White House. Duke, he gave himself the nickname, learned piano as a child, formed his first band at 17. By 1923, he'd moved to New York, was playing rent parties and small clubs, barely scraping by. In 1927, he was 28 years old, unknown outside Harlem, and broke. His band was booked at a small club on 139th Street, making $40 per week total. That's $8 per musician. Then the Cotton Club's regular bandleader quit unexpectedly. Madden needed a replacement immediately. Someone recommended Ellington. Duke auditioned on December 4th, 1927. He walked into the Cotton Club for the first time, saw the jungle set, the whites-only tables, the slot machines in the back, and he understood exactly what he was walking into. But he also understood the opportunity. National radio broadcasts. $750 per week for the whole band. 10 times what he was making. He took the job. And he made a decision. He'd give them what they wanted, but he'd make it so good they couldn't ignore his artistry. Madden wanted jungle music? Fine. Ellington created the jungle sound. Growling brass, trumpets played with plunger mutes to sound like animal roars, pounding tom-toms, wailing clarinets, music that sounded primitive to white ears but was actually harmonically sophisticated, complex, revolutionary. White audiences heard savagery. Musicians heard genius. Ellington was doing both at the same time. The Cotton Club broadcasts started in January 1928. Every Saturday night, CBS Radio carried Ellington's orchestra live from the Cotton Club to listeners across the country. Suddenly, Duke Ellington wasn't a Harlem bandleader. He was a national phenomenon. White musicians in Kansas City and Chicago were studying his arrangements. Black musicians everywhere were trying to copy his sound. By 1929, Duke Ellington was the most famous black musician in America, and he was trapped. The Cotton Club contract kept him locked in. $750 per week was incredible money. That's $15,000 in today's dollars, nearly $800,000 per year. But he couldn't tour, couldn't record extensively, couldn't play for black audiences, except when Madden gave permission. And Ellington knew what he was doing. Years later, he'd say, "The Cotton Club was a necessity. It wasn't a choice." In 1927, there was no path for a black musician to reach a national audience, except through white gatekeepers. Madden was the gatekeeper. You could reject him on principle and stay poor, or you could work with him and use the platform to build something bigger. I chose the platform. I'm not proud of the jungle sets, the segregated audience, the costumes we made the dancers wear, but I'm proud of the music, and the music wouldn't exist without that stage. Cab Calloway arrived at the Cotton Club in 1930, replacing Ellington when Duke finally got released from his contract. Calloway was 23, from Baltimore, full of energy and charisma. He created Hi-De-Ho, the call and response that became his trademark. White audiences loved it, thought it was hilarious, primitive. Calloway didn't care. He was making $1,000 per week. But Calloway told a story later, about a night in 1932. He was backstage between sets, still in his white tuxedo with tails. A white couple tried to enter the backstage area, looking for the bathroom. The Cotton Club bouncer stopped them, said, "Performers only back here." The white man pointed at Calloway and said, "But that N-word is back here." The bouncer, without hesitation, said, "He's not a customer. He's entertainment, like the piano." Calloway stood there in his $1,000 per week tuxedo and realized exactly what he was. Not an artist. Not even a person. Entertainment. An object. Like the piano. Like the jungle sets. Like the fake palm trees. He finished his contract. He didn't renew. By 1933, he was touring independently, playing for integrated audiences in Chicago and Detroit, making less money, but sleeping better at night. That was the Cotton Club. It made careers. It paid well. It broadcast black genius to America. And it dehumanized everyone who worked there. Both things were true simultaneously. You can't separate them. By 1930, the Cotton Club was grossing $40,000 per month. That's $840,000 today. Nearly $10 million per year. Only Madden had turned a $12,000 investment into a money printing machine. And he wasn't alone. Because while the Cotton Club was the most famous, it wasn't the only model. Harlem had developed 3 distinct nightclub models by the late 1920s. The Cotton Club was one, and then there were the other 2. Harlem had become the nightlife capital of America. More nightclubs per square block than anywhere else on Earth. And 3 of them tell you everything you need to know about how race, culture, and capitalism intersected in Prohibition-era New York. Model 1. The Cotton Club. We just covered it. Mob-owned, whites-only audience. Black performers. Segregated, extractive, but professionally run and highly profitable. Model 2. The Savoy Ballroom. Opened March 1926. Lenox Avenue, between 140 and 141. And it was different from the beginning. The Savoy was owned by 2 white Jewish businessmen, Mo Gale and Jay Fagan. They weren't criminals. They were legitimate businessmen who saw an opportunity. But here's what made them different from Madden. They hired a black manager, Charles Buchanan, and they gave him real authority. Buchanan made one decision that changed everything. Integrated admission. Black and white customers. Same door, same dance floor, same prices. In 1926 America, that was revolutionary. Borderline illegal in some contexts. But Buchanan believed and convinced his bosses that the music was good enough that white people would pay to dance with black people, or at least in the same room. The Savoy opened on March 12, 1926. 5,000 people showed up opening night. They had capacity for 4,000. The fire marshal almost shut them down before the first song ended. The place was mobbed. And here's why. The Savoy was massive. The dance floor was 250 feet long, 50 feet wide, 12,000 square feet of hardwood floor. 2 bandstands, so music never stopped. When one band finished, the other started immediately. The Savoy advertised, no sitting down. You came to dance, not to drink. Yes, they served alcohol. This was Prohibition. Of course they served alcohol. But it wasn't the point. The point was the music and the dancing. Chick Webb became the Savoy's house band in 1927. Webb was a dwarf, 4 feet tall, hunchbacked from tuberculosis of the spine. He could barely see over his drum kit. But when he played, the floor shook. He was the most powerful drummer in jazz, and his band could swing harder than anyone. And the dancers at the Savoy invented the Lindy Hop. It happened organically in 1928. The Lindy Hop was the first American dance form that incorporated African movement vocabulary with European partner dancing. You'd swing your partner out, pull them back, throw them over your hip, catch them midair. It was athletic, improvisational, joyful. And critically, it was partner dancing. Not line dancing, not solo dancing, partner dancing, which meant black men dancing with black women, white men dancing with white women, and sometimes, in the Savoy, where integration was real, black men dancing with white women, white men dancing with black women. In 1928, America, that was scandalized, and that's exactly what brought crowds. By 1930, the Savoy was doing $7,000 per week in revenue. That's $520,000 per year in 1930 dollars. $11 million in today's money. Not quite Cotton Club numbers, but close. And here's the difference. The Savoy had black management taking salaries, black musicians getting paid fairly, and black and white customers mixing freely. Charles Buchanan later said, "The Savoy proved something important. You didn't need segregation to be profitable. You didn't need to exoticize black culture or make white people feel like they were on safari. You just needed great music and space to dance. That's it. That's the whole business model." But even the Savoy had compromises. Buchanan wasn't an owner. He was a manager. The profits went to Gale and Fagan. And when Buchanan wanted to expand, open a second location, share in ownership, they said no. He was valuable, but not that valuable. And there was another issue. The mob. Because you couldn't run a nightclub in Harlem without paying protection. The Savoy paid Oni Madden $500 per month. Later, when Dutch Schultz took over, they paid him $1,000. It was the cost of doing business. Pay the mob or get bombed. Those were the options. But at least the Savoy tried. At least it existed as an alternative model. Proof that integration could work. Proof that you could respect black culture while profiting from it. And then, there was Model 3. Small's Paradise, opened October 1925, at 2294 7th Avenue, at 135th Street. Owner, Ed Smalls. Black man, born in South Carolina, moved to Harlem in 1918, worked as a porter, saved his money, and in 1925, bought a building and opened a club. Small's Paradise was different from both the Cotton Club and the Savoy. It was smaller, 400 capacity. It was black-owned, and most importantly, it catered primarily to black customers. Yes, white slummers came. Smalls didn't turn them away. Money was money. But the vibe was black. The music was for black audiences. The culture wasn't performed for white consumption. It just was. Smalls innovated constantly. He was the first club owner to hire singing waiters. They delivered drinks while performing choreographed dance numbers. He installed a dance floor that lit up with colored lights. He brought in the best bands before they were famous, paid them $75 per week, and let them play what they wanted. Small's Paradise. In 1926 was where Black Harlem went to celebrate. Weddings, birthdays, business deals. The Cotton Club was where white people went to watch black people. The Savoy was where both races went to dance together. Smalls was where black people went to be themselves. But Smalls was also the most vulnerable. Because Ed Smalls didn't have mob protection. He couldn't afford it. He paid the police $50 per week to ignore prohibition violations. But he didn't have the muscle to fight off rivals. In 1928, Dutch Schultz sent men to Smalls demanding a $1,000 per month protection fee. Smalls refused. 2 weeks later, someone threw a Molotov cocktail through the front window at 3 a.m. Luckily, the club was closed. No one died. Smalls paid. He had no choice. $1,000 per month came out of his profits. He'd been clearing $2,000 per month. Now, he was clearing $1,000. And that $1,000 going to Schultz? That was $1,000 extracted from the black community's only major black-owned nightclub. By 1930, Smalls was struggling. Not failing, but not thriving. The overhead plus the protection money was killing margins. Smalls considered selling. He'd hold on until 1938, but eventually, he'd sell to white owners. And Small's Paradise would become just another mob-controlled nightclub. 3 models, 3 outcomes. The Cotton Club. Massive success, cultural impact, complete exploitation. Made Ellington and Calloway famous while dehumanizing them nightly. Generated millions for the mob while paying performers well, by black standards, miserably, by white standards. The Savoy. Integrated success, profit sharing with black managers, but not black owners. Proved integration was possible, but still ultimately white controlled. Survived the longest, stayed open until 1958, but never became black owned. Small's Paradise. Black ownership, community focus, artistic freedom. Also, chronic financial pressure, mob extortion, eventual forced sale to white buyers. You had to choose. Financial success with exploitation, integration with white control, or independence with vulnerability. There was no fourth option, no path to black ownership, artistic freedom, and financial security. The system didn't allow it. And the artists caught in the middle, they navigated as best they could. Duke Ellington played the Cotton Club, banked his salary, and used the fame to launch a touring career where he could play for black audiences. Chick Webb made the Savoy his home, created the greatest dance band in America, and died at 34 from tuberculosis because he couldn't afford proper medical care despite being famous. And the musicians at Small's Paradise? Most of them never got recorded, never got famous, played for their community, and died in obscurity. But there was one place where the artists, the gangsters, and the intellectuals all mixed on equal terms. One place where the contradictions of the Harlem Renaissance were on full display. One place where you might see Langston Hughes arguing with Stephanie St. Clair while Casper Holstein paid for everyone's drinks. Alelia Walker's townhouse on 136th Street. And the salon that would become the symbolic heart of the Renaissance, even as it exposed all its moral compromises. Alelia Walker wasn't a gangster. She wasn't a musician. She wasn't a writer. She was an heiress. And in the 1920s, she became the most important social connector in Harlem. Her mother was Madam C.J. Walker, born Sarah Breedlove in Louisiana in 1867 to formerly enslaved parents. Madam Walker invented a line of hair care products for black women, built a cosmetics empire, and by 1919 was the richest black woman in America, worth over $2 million. That's $35 million today. When Madam Walker died in 1919, Alelia inherited everything. The money, the properties, the business. She was 34 years old, had never worked a day in her life, and suddenly had more money than 99% of Americans would see in a lifetime. She could have done anything. She chose to throw parties. In 1927, she opened the Dark Tower, a literary salon in her townhouse at 108 to 1010 West 136th Street. The building itself was ostentatious. 5 stories, 14 rooms, marble floors, hand-carved woodwork. The Dark Tower occupied the ground floor and basement. She'd had the walls painted in gold and silver, hung African masks and modern art, installed custom furniture. And every Saturday night, she opened her doors, invitation only. If you were someone in Harlem, an artist, a writer, a musician, a patron, or yes, a gangster with money, you got invited. Langston Hughes was a regular. Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay. These were the literary lions of the Renaissance, but also attending Casper Holstein, Stephanie St. Clair, numbers bankers, policy operators, bootleggers, and white patrons. Carl Van Vechten, the white writer who made a career interpreting Harlem for white audiences. Charlotte Osgood Mason, the elderly white patron who funded Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston's work, but demanded they write about primitive black life. The Dark Tower was where all these contradictory forces met, where high art and low crime drank the same champagne, where black intellectuals debated the talented 10th philosophy, while the money funding those intellectuals came from policy profits extracted from the working class. And Alelia Walker? She was the center of it all, not because she created anything, but because she had money and space and a genuine love of artists. She'd walk around her salon, glass of champagne in hand, introducing people. Langston, meet Casper. Casper runs the numbers. He funded the Opportunity Award you won. Casper, Langston's working on a novel about working class black life. Maybe you know some stories he could use? And they'd talk. The poet and the gangster. And something would come of it. A story, a poem, a perspective. The Dark Tower facilitated thousands of these conversations. But it also exposed the moral contradictions nobody wanted to discuss. A typical Saturday night at the Dark Tower. Langston Hughes is there, reciting a new poem, The Weary Blues. It's about a piano player in a dingy club, pouring his soul into music, while the audience ignores him. The poem is brilliant. Everyone applauds. Afterward, Casper Holstein approaches Hughes. They know each other. Holstein funded Hughes's first published collection. Holstein hands Hughes an envelope, $500. For your next collection, take your time, write it right. Hughes takes the money. He needs it. He's living on $3 a week. This $500 will let him write for 6 months without worrying about rent. But as he pockets the envelope, he knows where the money came from. Some grandmother in Harlem bet her last nickel this week, hoping for a miracle. She lost. Her nickel, along with thousands of others, became Holstein's profit. Holstein's profit became Hughes's grant. Stephanie St. Clair is watching this exchange. She walks over, champagne glass in hand. "Don't be ashamed, baby," she says to Hughes. "We all take money from sinners. At least we're black sinners. Better than taking it from white patrons who want you to write noble savage stories." She's talking about Charlotte Osgood Mason, who's standing 20 feet away. Mason funded Zora Neale Hurston's folklore research, but with conditions. Hurston had to write about primitive black culture, had to portray black people as closer to nature, less civilized. Mason called it authenticity. Hurston called it playing the game to get the check. Hughes laughs at St. Clair's comment, but the scene ends with him alone in a corner, looking at Holstein's envelope, wondering what his art costs. This was the Dark Tower, a place where the contradictions were visible, acknowledged, and never resolved. Because they couldn't be resolved. The Harlem Renaissance needed funding. White patrons demanded stereotypes. Black gangsters offered money with no artistic strings attached, but that money came from exploiting the black community. There was no clean money. Anywhere. Alelia Walker spent $10,000 on a single party in 1928. That's $180,000 today. Imported champagne, live orchestra, catered food from the best restaurants, and the next week, families 3 blocks away were skipping meals because rent was due. Langston Hughes wrote about this contradiction constantly. In 1926, he published an essay called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. The thesis, black artists should create for black audiences, without regard for white approval. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. Beautiful sentiment. But Hughes wrote that essay while living in a room paid for by Charlotte Osgood Mason, who expected him to write about primitive black life. And he published it in The Nation, a white magazine read primarily by white audiences. The contradiction wasn't hypocrisy. It was survival. Because in 1920s America, there was no path to being a black artist that didn't involve compromise. You could compromise with white patrons who wanted stereotypes. You could compromise with black gangsters whose money came from exploiting the community. Or you could refuse to compromise and die in poverty. Zora Neale Hurston chose the white patron route. She took Mason's money, wrote the folklore books Mason wanted, and used the platform to also write what she wanted. Novels like Their Eyes Were Watching God that were far more complex than anything Mason would have approved. She played the game, took the money, and did her real work on the side. Duke Ellington chose the gangster route, played the Cotton Club, smiled for white audiences, and used the fame and money to record his own compositions, the ones that weren't jungle music, the ones that were harmonically sophisticated and impossible to reduce to stereotypes. Langston Hughes tried both routes simultaneously, took money from white patrons and black gangsters, wrote populist poetry for black audiences, and also wrote essays for white magazines explaining black culture. He navigated, compromised, code switched, and produced some of the greatest American poetry ever written. Were they sellouts or survivors? Both? Neither? The Dark Tower never answered that question. It just provided the space where everyone could see the machinery operating, where the money, the art, and the exploitation were all visible at once. By 1930, the Dark Tower was still operating, but the Renaissance was showing cracks. The stock market had crashed in October 1929. The Depression was beginning. Harlem's unemployment rate hit 50%. Policy gambling increased. Desperate people chasing miracles, which meant Holstein and St. Clair were making more money than ever from people who could afford it least. And the mob was watching. Dutch Schultz had spent the 1920s consolidating power in the Bronx and Manhattan. By 1930, he controlled most of the bootleg liquor trade in New York. But Prohibition was obviously ending. Everyone knew it. Schultz needed a new revenue stream. He looked at Harlem and saw $20 million per year in policy profits. Run by black operators who had no muscle, no political connections strong enough to fight him. It was there for the taking. The golden age was about to end. Not gradually, violently. Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flagenheimer, 1901, the Bronx. Jewish family, poverty. Father abandoned them when Arthur was 14. He started as a street thug, worked his way up to bootlegging, and by 1928 controlled beer distribution across the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. Schultz was a sadist. His nickname among associates was the Dutchman, but people who crossed him called him the psychopath. He once beat a man to death with a baseball bat because the man had looked at him wrong in a bar. Another time, he hung a rival upside down from a meat hook and left him to die slowly. This wasn't strategy. It was who he was. By 1930, Schultz was making $2 million per year from bootlegging. That's $37 million today. He was rich, powerful, and paranoid. Prohibition was ending. Everyone could see it coming. In 1932, the Democrats would nominate FDR, who ran on a repeal platform. Schultz knew his bootleg empire had maybe 3 years left. He needed to diversify, and his lieutenant, a man named Abe Landau, told him about Harlem's policy racket. $20 million per year, run by independent black operators, no mob affiliation, minimal protection. Schultz sent men to observe. They came back with numbers. Casper Holstein, 12 policy banks, $2 million per year in revenue. Stephanie St. Clair, 10 banks, $1.5 million per year. 24 other smaller operators, another $5 million combined. Schultz did the math. If he took over the whole thing, he'd make $20 million per year. Minus the expenses of running it, minus payouts, he'd clear maybe $8 million in profit. 4 times what he made from bootlegging. And unlike bootlegging, policy gambling wasn't going to be legalized. It would stay illegal forever, which meant permanent profit. In March 1930, Schultz made his move. But he didn't start with Holstein or St. Clair. He started with the small operators, the ones who couldn't fight back. His men walked into a policy bank on 145th Street. The operator was a man named Wilfred Brunder, ran 2 banks, made about $50,000 per year. Schultz's men said, "You work for us now. We take 70%. You get 30%. You run the operation, we protect you." Brunder said no. 2 days later, someone threw a bomb through his window. Brunder wasn't home. His wife and daughter were. They survived, but barely. Brunder got the message. He signed the deal. Schultz repeated this pattern. Bomb threats, beatings, murders. By the end of 1930, he controlled 15 of the smaller policy operations. He was making about $3 million per year from them. But he wanted the big ones, Holstein and St. Clair. In January 1931, Schultz sent men to meet with Casper Holstein. The meeting was in a restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Schultz's representative laid it out. "You're taking in $60,000 per week. That's $3 million per year. We want 70%. You keep running it, we take most of the profit. In exchange, we protect you from other mobs. We pay the police, and you stay alive." Holstein said no. He'd built this operation over 20 years. He wasn't handing it over to a white gangster who'd showed up yesterday. "This is Black Harlem's money," Holstein said. "It stays in Black Harlem." The Schultz representative smiled. "We'll see." 1 week later, January 23rd, 1931, Casper Holstein was kidnapped. He was walking home from a nightclub at 2 a.m. 3 men grabbed him off the street, threw him in a car, drove him to a warehouse in the Bronx. They held him for 5 days, demanded $50,000 ransom. Holstein's associates paid. Holstein came back alive, but traumatized. He was 53 years old, and for the first time in his life, he'd been powerless. Held in a basement, threatened with death, and he knew, everyone knew, who was behind it. Schultz. The kidnapping was a message. "We can take you anytime. Cooperate or die." Holstein paid Schultz 30%. Not 70, but 30. A compromise. And with that payment, the independent black policy racket began to die. But Stephanie St. Clair refused. Stephanie St. Clair, Queenie, the only woman running a major criminal operation in New York. We've mentioned her before, but now it's time to understand who she actually was. Born in Martinique, sometime around 1897. Her mother was a domestic servant, her father unknown. She grew up in extreme poverty. immigrated to the United States in 1912, arrived in Harlem at age 15 with nothing, worked as a domestic servant for white families in Brooklyn. By 1923, she was running her own policy bank. How? Nobody knows exactly. She never gave interviews about her origins, but by 1925, she had 10 banks. By 1930, 42. She was making $1.5 million per year, had 300 employees, and ran the most disciplined operation in Harlem. No corruption, no skimming. She paid winners immediately, published results in the newspaper, and had a reputation for absolute honesty. She also had a reputation for violence. She carried a knife and a pistol. She'd been arrested multiple times for assault. She once stabbed a man who tried to rob one of her collectors. The man survived. She served 6 months at Bedford Hills Prison, came out, and went right back to work. When Schultz sent men to her in 1931, she told them, "I don't pay white men who think they can take what black people built. You want my operation? Come take it. But you'll bleed for it." Schultz took that as a challenge. Between 1931 and 1933, Schultz waged war on Stephanie St. Clair. He bombed her banks, 8 different locations destroyed. He murdered her collectors, at least 12 men killed. He bribed the police to raid her operations repeatedly, while leaving his own untouched. He offered her runners more money to switch sides. St. Clair fought back. She hired muscle, including a young enforcer named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, just released from Sing Sing after serving 5 years for armed robbery. Bumpy was 26, 6 feet tall, intelligent, and absolutely fearless. St. Clair paid him $200 per week, more than he'd ever made legally, to protect her operations and hit back at Schultz's men. And hit back he did. In 1932, 3 of Schultz's collectors were found beaten nearly to death in an alley off 132nd Street. Everyone knew Bumpy did it. Nobody could prove it. But Schultz had the NYPD. And in October 1933, the police raided St. Clair's home, found policy slips, arrested her for operating an illegal gambling operation. She was convicted and sentenced to 2 to 5 years at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She was 46 years old, and Schultz thought he'd won. He was wrong. From prison, St. Clair continued running her operation. She smuggled instructions out through visitors, communicated through coded letters, and kept her banks operating. Bumpy Johnson ran day-to-day operations. The money kept flowing. And St. Clair gave interviews from prison to the Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper. She became a folk hero. Queen of Harlem refuses to bow to white gangster. The articles portrayed her as a freedom fighter, a black woman standing up to white oppression, which was partially true. She was also a criminal extracting money from the poorest neighborhood in New York. Both things were true. By 1935, Schultz controlled about 60% of Harlem's policy racket. He was making $12 million per year from it. But he'd made enemies. Not just St. Clair. The other mob bosses, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky. They were watching Schultz operate with increasing concern. He was violent, unpredictable, drew too much police attention, and he was making too much money without sharing. In 1935, Schultz made a fatal mistake. Thomas Dewey, a federal prosecutor, was building a case against organized crime in New York. Schultz was a primary target. Schultz wanted to kill Dewey. He brought the proposal to the commission, the board of mob bosses that governed organized crime. "Let me kill the prosecutor," Schultz said. Problem solved. Lucky Luciano said no. "You kill a federal prosecutor. The heat comes down on all of us. You're not doing it." Schultz did it anyway. He sent men to surveil Dewey's apartment, planned the assassination. Luciano found out. And on October 23, 1935, 2 men walked into the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, where Dutch Schultz was having dinner. They shot him and 3 of his associates. Schultz died 22 hours later in the hospital. His last words were delirious ramblings, fever dreams, nothing coherent. When Stephanie St. Clair, still in prison, heard about Schultz's death, she sent a telegram to the Amsterdam News. The telegram said, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." The war was over. Schultz was dead, but the independent black policy racket didn't return. Because Lucky Luciano had other plans. The golden age of the Harlem Renaissance. The era when black operators controlled their own underground economy. When artists like Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington had funding from black sources. When the Cotton Club and the Savoy were at their peak. That age ended in 1935. What came next was compromise, collaboration, and the slow realization that black Harlem would never be economically independent as long as white organized crime wanted a piece of it. October 29, 1929. Black Tuesday. The stock market crashes. $13 million in wealth evaporates in a single day. That's $240 billion in today's money. Banks fail. Businesses close. Unemployment skyrockets. The Great Depression begins. Harlem was already poor. Now it became desperate. By 1930, unemployment in Harlem hit 50%. That's not a typo. Half of all adults in Harlem had no job, no income, no prospects. The factories that had hired black workers during World War I closed or laying off. Last hired, first fired was the rule. Black workers got dismissed before white workers every single time. The average Harlem family in 1930 was earning $8 per week. That's $140 in today's money, per week, for a family of 4 or 5. Rent alone was $40 to $60 per month. Do the math. $8 per week is $32 per month. How do you pay $60 rent on $32 income? You don't. Eviction rates in Harlem tripled between 1929 and 1932. Families got thrown onto the street with their furniture. You'd walk down Lenox Avenue and see household belongings piled on the sidewalk. Beds, chairs, pots, a family sitting on their couch in the street because they had nowhere else to go. The rent party circuit, which had been a cultural phenomenon in the 1920s, became pure survival in the 1930s. Not, let's throw a party and make some extra money. More like, we eat this week or we don't. And the only way we eat is if 80 people show up on Saturday. And here's what that did to the music. It killed the joy. Listen to jazz recordings from 1925 versus 1933. 1925. Exuberant, experimental, playful. 1933. Still technically brilliant, but there's a darkness underneath. Because the musicians weren't playing for fun anymore. They were playing to survive, and the audiences weren't dancing for joy. They were dancing to forget. Fats Waller recorded I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Write Myself a Letter in 1935. It's a comedic song on the surface. He's so lonely, he's writing himself a love letter. But listen to the piano playing underneath the comedy. There's desperation there. Waller was broke in 1935, owed back taxes, dodging creditors. The song was recorded for money he needed immediately. The comedy was survival. Duke Ellington was more fortunate. The Cotton Club broadcasts had made him nationally famous. He could tour, play for white audiences across the country, command serious fees. But even Ellington felt the pressure. In 1931, he wrote Mood Indigo. It's one of the most beautiful compositions in jazz history, and it's about poverty. The title is a play on words. Mood Indigo equals Mood Indighetto. The song is melancholic, haunting, blue. That's Depression Harlem in musical form. But while the musicians struggled, while families starved, while unemployment devastated the community, one industry was booming: policy gambling. The numbers racket exploded during the Depression, because when you have no hope, you buy hope, and policy sold hope for a nickel. In 1929, before the crash, Harlem's policy banks were collecting about $60,000 per week collectively. By 1932, $200,000 per week, more than triple. The worse the economy got, the more people gambled. And it made a sick kind of sense. You're a domestic worker. You make $3 per week. Your family needs $10 for food and rent. You can work yourself to death and still come up $7 short. Or you can bet a nickel and pray. If you win, you get $3. That's your food budget. If you lose, you're only down a nickel. The math was brutal, but from the player's perspective, it was rational. You were broke either way. At least policy gave you a chance. Casper Holstein understood this, and it tormented him. He was making more money than ever. By 1932, his operation was pulling in $4 million per year. But he knew he was profiting from desperation. He told a reporter in 1932, "I'm feeding off starvation. People are betting money they need for food, and I'm taking it. I know I'm taking it. But if I shut down tomorrow, someone else would take my place. The game doesn't stop because I have a conscience." That's the central moral question of the Depression-era policy racket. Was Holstein responsible for the harm he caused? Or was he just operating within a system that was already designed to exploit black people, and at least he was black? At least some of the money stayed in the community? There's no clean answer. Holstein did fund the arts. He did employ hundreds of people. He did operate honestly. He always paid winners, never rigged the game. But he also extracted millions from the poorest community in New York and kept most of it. And then Dutch Schultz arrived and made everything worse. Between 1930 and 1933, Schultz systematically took over Harlem's policy racket. We covered some of this already: the bombings, the kidnapping of Holstein, the war with Stephanie St. Clair. But let's talk about what that war did to the culture. The Renaissance was dying. Not because the artists stopped creating, but because the ecosystem that sustained them collapsed. Holstein, after being kidnapped in 1931, was never the same. He paid Schultz 30% of his revenue, but the psychological damage was permanent. The man who'd been the Bolito King, who'd walked through Harlem like royalty, who'd funded Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, he became paranoid, withdrawn, broken. By 1935, he'd sold most of his operations. By 1938, he was nearly broke. He died in 1944 in poverty, forgotten. The money that had funded the Harlem Renaissance, the literary prizes, the artist stipends, the theater productions, that money dried up. Holstein stopped giving. Other policy bankers were either taken over by Schultz or went out of business. The underground economy that had sustained black culture, Schultz extracted 70% of it and sent it downtown to white mob bosses. And the artists? They scattered. Langston Hughes moved to California in 1934, tried to make it in Hollywood. Zora Neale Hurston went back to Florida, lived on the edge of poverty while writing Their Eyes Were Watching God. Duke Ellington was still famous, still touring, but he wasn't playing Harlem anymore. The Cotton Club had moved to Midtown in 1936, became a tourist trap for white audiences. The music didn't stop, but the community that had created it was being destroyed. Meanwhile, the violence was escalating. Between 1931 and 1935, at least 40 people were murdered in the Harlem policy wars. Collectors shot on street corners. Runners who refused to switch sides found dead in alleys. One bombing in 1933 killed a family of 4. Wrong address. Schultz's men hit the wrong building. The NYPD didn't investigate, because the NYPD was on Schultz's payroll. He paid $20,000 per month to the police, that's $440,000 today, for non-enforcement. Every cop from beat officers to precinct captains got a cut. In exchange, they raided black-owned policy banks while leaving Schultz's operations alone. And the nightlife. The clubs were still open, still packed, but the atmosphere had changed. The Cotton Club in 1933 wasn't the same as the Cotton Club in 1928. The music was still good, but it was performed under the shadow of violence. Everyone knew the mob ran everything now. Everyone knew Harlem wasn't independent anymore. Small's Paradise was barely hanging on. Ed Smalls was paying Schultz $1,000 per month, which ate up half his profit. He'd stopped innovating, stopped hiring new talent. The club was surviving, not thriving. The Savoy was doing better because it catered to dancers, and people still needed to dance, still needed some joy. Chick Webb's orchestra was at its peak in the mid-1930s, and the Lindy Hoppers were performing feats of athletic brilliance. But even the Savoy was paying protection money. $1,000 per month to Schultz, same as everyone else. And then there was Stephanie St. Clair, in prison, refusing to surrender. October 1933. Stephanie St. Clair is convicted on charges of operating an illegal gambling operation. The evidence: policy slips found in her apartment during a police raid. The sentence: 2 to 5 years at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, a women's prison 60 miles north of New York City. She's 46 years old. Dutch Schultz thinks he's won. But St. Clair doesn't fold. She doesn't negotiate. From prison, she continues running her operation. Here's how it worked. Bumpy Johnson, her enforcer, became the day-to-day operator. He was 28 years old, recently released from Sing Sing, and absolutely loyal to St. Clair. She paid him $300 per week, that's $6,000 in today's money, to run her 10 remaining policy banks and protect them from Schultz. St. Clair communicated through coded letters. She'd write to Bumpy about recipes and fabric orders, but the numbers embedded in the letters were instructions: which banks to move, which collectors to promote, which of Schultz's men to target. The prison censors never caught on. She also received visitors. Her lawyer came weekly, carrying messages from Bumpy. Her friends brought newspapers so she could read about the war she was fighting from inside. And she gave interviews. This is the part that made her legendary. In January 1934, the Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper, sent a reporter to interview St. Clair at Bedford Hills. The warden allowed it, thinking it would be harmless. St. Clair used the opportunity to wage psychological warfare. The interview ran with the headline, "Queen of Policy speaks from prison. I'd rather die standing than live on my knees." In the interview, St. Clair said, "Dutch Schultz thinks he can take what black people built. He thinks violence and bombs will make us submit. He's wrong. I'm in prison, yes, but my operation is still running. My people are still working. And Schultz, he's made an enemy he can't beat. Because I don't fear death. I fear living as a slave. And I will never, never bow to a white gangster who thinks he can own Harlem." That interview electrified Black Harlem. Suddenly, St. Clair wasn't just a numbers banker. She was a symbol. A black woman standing up to white oppression, fighting from prison, refusing to surrender. The fact that she was a criminal? Irrelevant. In the context of 1934, Harlem, where black people had no political power, no economic power, no ability to fight back against systemic oppression, St. Clair's defiance mattered more than her criminality. The Amsterdam News published follow-up interviews. In one, St. Clair talked about Schultz's bombings. "He destroys property because he can't destroy will. He kills my collectors because he can't kill my spirit. Every bomb he throws, every man he murders, he proves he's afraid. Afraid that a black woman has something he'll never have: the loyalty of her community." Was that true? Partially. St. Clair did have loyalty. Her runners stayed with her even when Schultz offered more money. But it was complicated loyalty. They were loyal because she paid fairly, because she protected them, because she was black, and Schultz was white, but also because they had no better options. This was the only economy that would hire them. Langston Hughes was paying attention. In 1934, he wrote a poem called Ballad of the Landlord. It wasn't directly about St. Clair, but it was inspired by her. The poem is about a black tenant who refuses to pay rent because the landlord won't fix the building. The tenant threatens the landlord. The landlord calls the police. The tenant gets arrested and branded a criminal for demanding basic dignity. The poem ends, "Police, police, come and get this man. He's trying to ruin the government and overturn the land." That's St. Clair's story. She's running an illegal business, yes, but she's also refusing to let white gangsters colonize Harlem's economy. And the system, the police, the courts, the prison, brands her a criminal for resisting. Hughes never published that poem in a mainstream magazine. He knew white editors wouldn't understand it. But he read it at the Dark Tower in 1935, and everyone there understood exactly what he meant. Meanwhile, in prison, St. Clair was building alliances. Bedford Hills had a significant black population. Women imprisoned for theft, prostitution, numbers running, all crimes of poverty. St. Clair became a leader inside. She organized the women, negotiated with guards for better treatment, and ran an underground economy inside the prison. Cigarettes, contraband, favors. She was doing inside what she'd done outside, building an organization through intelligence and force of will. The warden hated her, but he couldn't break her. St. Clair served 3 years, was released in October 1936, and walked out of Bedford Hills to a crowd of 200 Harlem residents waiting for her. They treated her like a returning hero, but the world she returned to was different. Dutch Schultz was dead, murdered in October 1935 by Lucky Luciano's order. The policy war was over, and Luciano had offered Bumpy Johnson a deal. St. Clair came home expecting to reclaim her empire. Instead, she found that Bumpy had made a compromise. To understand how the Harlem policy racket became entrenched, how it survived police raids and federal investigations, how it operated openly for decades, you have to understand the political machine. And that machine had a name: Jimmy Hines. James J. Hines. Born 1877, grew up in the Tenderloin district of Manhattan, started as a saloon worker, became a Tammany Hall district leader by 1912. Tammany Hall was the Democratic political machine that controlled New York City politics from the 1850s through the 1930s. If you wanted anything in New York, a job, a liquor license, a building permit, protection from police, you went through Tammany. By 1930, Jimmy Hines controlled the 11th Assembly District, which included Harlem and parts of Midtown. And Hines understood something crucial. Harlem had votes. Black voters had been migrating from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, to the Democratic Party since the 1920s. By 1930, Harlem was delivering 60,000 votes per election. That was power. Tammany wanted those votes. Hines made a deal. He appointed a black man, Ferdinand Q. Morton, as the Black Commissioner of New York City, a largely ceremonial position with no real authority, but significant symbolic value. Morton's job was to deliver Harlem's votes to Tammany. In exchange, Tammany would provide jobs: sanitation workers, building inspectors, low-level city employees. These jobs paid $30 to $40 per week, which in Depression-era Harlem was a fortune. Morton delivered. In the 1932 election, Harlem voted 80% Democratic. FDR carried New York in large part because of Harlem's turnout, and Hines rewarded Morton with more jobs, more patronage, more power. But there was another part of the deal that nobody talked about publicly. Hines protected the policy racket. Not the black operators. He let them get raided occasionally for show. But the big operations, the ones paying him, untouchable. And Dutch Schultz was paying him enormous amounts. Starting in 1931, when Schultz took over much of Harlem's policy racket, he paid Hines 10% of his policy profits as protection money. By 1933, that was $500,000 per year. That's $11 million today. Hines took that money and distributed it to judges who dismissed cases, to police captains who ignored violations, to prosecutors who declined to indict. The system worked like this. Schultz's policy banks operated openly. Runners collected bets on street corners in broad daylight. If anyone complained, the local precinct would say, "We don't have the resources to investigate." If someone got arrested anyway, the charges would be dropped. If charges somehow stuck, the sentence would be suspended. The fix was in at every level. Meanwhile, black-owned policy banks that didn't pay Schultz got raided constantly. Stephanie St. Clair got raided 12 times between 1931 and 1933 before finally being convicted. Casper Holstein got raided 8 times in 1932 alone. The message was clear: pay Schultz or go to prison. And Ferdinand Q. Morton? He knew exactly what was happening. He knew Tammany was protecting white gangsters while prosecuting black operators. He knew the system was designed to extract wealth from Harlem and funnel it to downtown bosses. But he justified it this way: better to have some power than no power. Better to get city jobs for 1,000 black men than to have those jobs go to white men. Better to work within the system than to be destroyed by it. Was he right? That's the impossible question. Morton did get jobs for thousands of black Harlemites. Real jobs with steady pay that fed families during the Depression. But he also enabled a system that extracted millions from the black community and sent it to white gangsters and politicians. Langston Hughes wrote about this contradiction. In 1935, he published a poem called "Let America Be America Again." The most famous line, "America never was America to me." The poem is about the gap between American ideals and American reality, about how democracy is supposed to work versus how it actually works, about how black people are told to participate in the system while the system is designed to exploit them. Hughes was thinking about Ferdinand Q. Morton when he wrote that. Morton was participating in democracy. He was a government official, delivering votes, working within the system, and the system was using him to legitimize the theft of Harlem's wealth. But here's the most damning part. The policy money funded Harlem's culture while simultaneously destroying it. Let's trace the money. A domestic worker bets a nickel on policy. She loses. That nickel goes to a policy bank. The bank is owned by Schultz. Schultz takes 70%, which goes to him and his mob associates. He takes 10% of that and pays Hines. Hines distributes that money to judges and cops. The remaining 30% stays with the local operators, Bumpy Johnson and other black gangsters working for Schultz. Some of that 30% gets reinvested in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson, in the mid-1930s, is making $500 per week working as Schultz's enforcer and operator. That's $10,000 today. He spends that money in Harlem, rents apartments, eats at black-owned restaurants, buys clothes from black tailors. That money circulates. But 70% leaves the neighborhood forever. $500,000 per year extracted from Harlem, sent to white gangsters and politicians. That's money that could have built businesses, funded schools, created generational wealth. Instead, it's gone. And the culture? By 1935, the Harlem Renaissance was functionally over. Not because people stopped creating, but because the funding structure collapsed. The nightclubs were still open, but they were mob-controlled. The artists were still working, but they were broke or scattered. The literary magazines had folded. The theater companies had closed. Alelia Walker died in 1931, and the Dark Tower closed with her. Casper Holstein stopped funding artists after his kidnapping. The rent party circuit still existed, but it was survival, not culture. The Cotton Club moved downtown in 1936 and became a different kind of place, a tourist destination where white audiences consumed watered-down Harlem style without any actual Harlem. The machine had won. Tammany Hall controlled Harlem's politics. The mob controlled Harlem's economy. And Black Harlem? Black Harlem had jobs, had survival, had some semblance of stability. But independence, ownership, self-determination, those were gone. And then, in October 1935, Dutch Schultz made a catastrophic mistake. October 1935. Dutch Schultz was making $12 million per year from Harlem's policy racket. He was the richest gangster in New York. He was also the most hated. The other mob bosses, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, they'd formed what they called the Commission in 1931. The idea was simple: organize crime like a business. Stop the wars, divide territories, cooperate for mutual profit. It worked. The Commission made everyone richer and safer. Except Schultz didn't follow the rules. He was violent, unpredictable, paranoid. He killed people for personal slights. He attracted police attention. And he refused to share Harlem's policy profits with the other bosses, claiming he'd earned it through conquest. By 1935, Schultz had another problem: Thomas Dewey. Dewey was the federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, and he'd made his name prosecuting organized crime. He'd already gotten convictions on Waxy Gordon, Lucky Luciano's rival. Now he was building a case against Schultz. Dewey was relentless. He subpoenaed witnesses, offered immunity deals, traced money through shell companies. and he was making progress. Schultz was going to be indicted on tax evasion charges, the same charges that got Al Capone. If convicted, Schultz would die in prison. Schultz had a solution. Kill Thomas Dewey. Kill the prosecutor. Problem solved. He brought the idea to the commission. In September 1935, he called a meeting with Luciano, Costello, and Lansky. "We killed Dewey," Schultz said. "I've already got men watching him. We hit him on his way to work. Make it look like a robbery. The case dies with him." Lucky Luciano said no. "You kill a federal prosecutor, the heat comes down on all of us. The FBI, the Treasury Department, the Army if they have to. They'll destroy organized crime in New York to avenge him. We don't kill prosecutors. We don't kill judges. We don't kill cops. Those are the rules," Schultz argued, got angry. Said he was doing it anyway, with or without permission. The commission voted, 4-1. Dutch Schultz had to die. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was eating dinner at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. He was with 3 associates: Abe Landau, his chief enforcer, Otto Berman, his accountant, and Lulu Rosenkrantz, his bodyguard. They were sitting at a round table in the back, discussing business. At 10:15 p.m., 2 men walked in: Charlie, the Bug Workman, and Mendy Weiss, hitmen sent by the commission. They walked straight to Schultz's table and opened fire. 20 shots in under 10 seconds. All 4 men hit. Schultz wasn't killed instantly. The bullet hit him in the stomach. He stumbled to the bathroom, collapsed. An ambulance took him to Newark City Hospital. He was conscious, delirious, in shock. The doctors couldn't save him. He died 22 hours later, on October 24th at 8:35 p.m. His last words were recorded by a police stenographer. They're mostly incoherent. "A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim. Oh, dog biscuits, and when he is happy, he doesn't get snappy. Fever dreams, morphine hallucinations, nothing useful." When Stephanie St. Clair, still in Bedford Hills prison, heard the news, she sent that famous telegram to the Amsterdam News. "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." Schultz was dead. The policy war was over, and Lucky Luciano inherited Harlem. Luciano was different from Schultz. Smarter, smoother, more strategic. He didn't wage war. He made deals. And in January 1936, he called a meeting with Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was 29 years old, running Stephanie St. Clair's operation while she was in prison. He'd been expecting this meeting, expecting Luciano to either make an offer or kill him. Luciano made an offer. "You run the policy racket in Harlem," Luciano said. "You know the neighborhood. You know the operators. You speak the language. I don't want to occupy Harlem. I want to profit from Harlem. So here's the deal. You run everything. I take 40%. You keep 60. You handle day-to-day operations. I provide protection, police, politicians, muscle if you need it. You're not working for me. You're working with me." Bumpy thought about it. He could say no, and Luciano would kill him and install someone else. He could say yes, and become the first black gangster with institutional mob backing. He said yes. The deal was structured simply. Every week, Bumpy would send 40% of policy profits to Luciano. In exchange, Luciano would ensure the NYPD left Bumpy alone, that Jimmy Hines continued protecting the racket through Tammany Hall, and that no other mob family tried to move in on Harlem. It worked. By mid-1936, Bumpy Johnson was running 20 policy banks, making $8,000 per week personally. That's $166,000 in today's money. Nearly $9 million per year. He was the richest black gangster in Harlem, maybe in America. But he wasn't independent. He was a partner in a system that extracted wealth from black Harlem and sent nearly half of it to white mob bosses. The dream of black economic independence, the dream Holstein and St. Clair had fought for, was dead. When Stephanie St. Clair got out of prison in October 1936, Bumpy explained the deal to her. She was furious. "I went to prison refusing to pay white gangsters," she said. "And you made a deal with them?" Bumpy's response: "You went to prison. I stayed alive. I kept your operation running. And now we're making more money than we ever made, with less violence. This is the best deal we're going to get. St. Clair never forgave him. She took a portion of the operation, ran a few policy banks independently, but she was never the power she'd been. By 1938, she'd mostly retired. She lived another 31 years, died in 1969, bitter and largely forgotten. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, became the king of Harlem. Not independent, but powerful. He ran the policy racket for Luciano until Luciano got convicted on prostitution charges in 1936 and sentenced to 30 to 50 years. Then, Bumpy worked with Frank Costello, Luciano's successor. Then, Meyer Lansky. Then, the Genovese family. For 30 years, Bumpy Johnson would be the mob's representative in Harlem. And in the 1950s, he'd mentor a young man from North Carolina named Frank Lucas. And that relationship would lead to another chapter entirely, one where Harlem's gangsters tried once more to break free from mob control. But that's later. For now, in 1936, the Harlem Renaissance was over. The Golden Age was dead. The independent black policy racket had become a subsidiary of the Italian mob. And the culture, the jazz, the nightlife, the art, continued, but transformed. No longer funded by black gangsters for black audiences. Now performed for white consumption, controlled by white owners, extracted for white profit. The machine was complete, and it would run for decades. Lucky Luciano controlled organized crime in New York. He controlled the docks, the unions, the prostitution rings, the gambling operations, and now, through his deal with Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's policy racket. Luciano was different from Dutch Schultz. He was born in Sicily in 1897, immigrated to New York as a child, grew up on the Lower East Side. He was ruthless when necessary, but preferred negotiation to violence. He'd organized the commission in 1931, brought structure to organized crime. He saw the mob as a business, not a gang. And he treated Bumpy Johnson like a business partner, not a subordinate. But partnership doesn't mean equality. Let's be clear about the power dynamic. Luciano controlled the police through Jimmy Hines, controlled the politicians through Tammany Hall, controlled the violence through his army of soldiers. Bumpy controlled the street-level operation in Harlem, but Luciano controlled everything that made that operation possible. The deal worked like this. Bumpy's policy banks collected bets 6 days a week. Sunday was the only day off. Each bank averaged $10,000 per week in bets. Bumpy ran 20 banks by 1937. That's $200,000 per week total, $10 million per year in 1937 dollars. $210 million in today's money. The payout rate was standard. 60% of bets paid out in winnings, 40% kept as profit. So from $10 million in annual bets, $4 million was profit. Luciano took 40% of that profit, $1.6 million per year. Bumpy kept the rest, $2.4 million. Out of Bumpy's share, he paid his runners, collectors, and bank managers. His personal take was about $500,000 per year, $10 million today. Bumpy Johnson was rich. By any measure, he was successful. But Harlem? Harlem was being drained. $10 million per year in bets from the poorest neighborhood in New York, and $1.6 million of that going straight to Italian gangsters downtown. That money could have built businesses, schools, housing. Instead, it paid for Luciano's lawyers, his bribes, his mansion in the Bronx. And the culture that had made Harlem famous, it was dying. Let's look at what happened to the major institutions between 1936 and 1940. The Cotton Club moved downtown in 1936. Oni Madden sold it. He was getting too much heat from federal prosecutors and decided to retire to Hot Springs, Arkansas. The new owners moved the club to 48th Street in Midtown Manhattan, turned it into a Broadway theater-style venue. Big productions, famous singers, but the connection to Harlem was severed. The authentic Harlem experience was now being performed 40 blocks away for white tourists who never had to set foot in a black neighborhood. Duke Ellington had left the Cotton Club in 1931, started touring nationally and internationally. By 1936, he was playing Carnegie Hall. recording constantly, making real money. But he wasn't playing Harlem regularly. There was no venue that could afford him, and the venues that existed were mob-controlled anyway. Ellington had transcended Harlem, which was good for him, but meant Harlem lost its most famous artist. Cab Calloway was in a similar position. After leaving the Cotton Club in 1934, he toured constantly, appeared in films, became a national celebrity. But like Ellington, he didn't come back to Harlem except for special occasions. The neighborhood that had made him famous couldn't hold him anymore. The Dark Tower had closed in 1931 when A'Lelia Walker died. There was no replacement. No salon where artists and gangsters and intellectuals mixed. No space for that kind of cultural cross-pollination. The literary magazines, Opportunity, The Crisis, Fire, they were all struggling or defunct by 1937. The funding had dried up. Casper Holstein wasn't giving money anymore. He was barely surviving. The white patrons had moved on to other causes, and the Depression meant nobody had money for frivolous things like poetry magazines. Langston Hughes was in California, working for the Hollywood studios and hating it. They wanted him to write stereotypical black characters for segregated films. He did it because he needed the money, but it destroyed something in him. He wrote to a friend in 1937, "I came to California to escape Harlem's poverty. Instead, I found Harlem's stereotypes are more profitable than Harlem's reality. I'm making good money writing lies." Zora Neale Hurston published Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1937, one of the greatest American novels ever written. It sold poorly, less than 5,000 copies. Why? Because it didn't fit what white publishers wanted from black writers. They wanted protest novels, sociology, racial struggle. Hurston wrote about a black woman's interior life, her desires, her autonomy. Critics, including black critics like Richard Wright, dismissed it as folk literature that avoided the real issues. The book went out of print in 1944. Hurston died in poverty in 1960, was buried in an unmarked grave. It took Alice Walker finding that grave in 1973 to resurrect Hurston's reputation. That's what happened to the Harlem Renaissance. The artists who survived did so by leaving Harlem, compromising their vision, or dying in obscurity. The ones who stayed, they struggled. Small's Paradise was still open, but Ed Smalls had sold it in 1938 to white owners. The new owners kept the name, kept the singing waiters, but it became a tourist destination. A place where white people came to see authentic Harlem nightlife that had been sanitized for their comfort. The rent party circuit still existed, but it was different. In the 1920s, rent parties had been cultural incubators where jazz was invented. By the late 1930s, they were just survival. The music was still good. There were always talented musicians in Harlem, but the joy was gone. People were dancing to forget, not to celebrate. And the one place that still represented what Harlem had been, what it could have been, the Savoy Ballroom. The Savoy in 1937 was still thriving, still integrated, still managed by Charles Buchanan, the black manager who'd made it work. Still home to Chick Webb's orchestra, which by 1937 was the most exciting band in jazz, and still the place where the Lindy Hop was being performed at its highest level. But even the Savoy was under pressure. Not financial pressure, it was making money. Moral pressure. White society was increasingly uncomfortable with the Savoy's integrated dance floor, uncomfortable with black men and white women dancing together, uncomfortable with the sexual energy, the freedom, the implicit challenge to segregation. In 1937, the Catholic Church launched a campaign against the Savoy, calling it a den of iniquity, where interracial mingling led to immorality. The campaign didn't work. The Savoy stayed open, but it showed which way the wind was blowing. The Renaissance was over, but nobody had officially declared it dead. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no moment when everyone agreed it was finished. It just slowly faded, like music getting quieter until you can't hear it anymore. But let's talk about what actually killed it. Not the Depression, though that didn't help. Not the mob takeover, though that extracted the wealth that had funded it. What killed the Harlem Renaissance was theft. Cultural theft. The systematic appropriation of black culture by white America, stripped of its black creators, repackaged and sold back without credit or compensation. By 1937, swing music was the most popular music in America. Benny Goodman was the king of swing. Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Artie Shaw. These were the biggest names in music. And every single one of them had learned from black musicians. Goodman's arrangements were written by Fletcher Henderson, a black band leader. Miller's style came from studying Chick Webb. Shaw copied Duke Ellington's harmonies. But the money, the fame, the recognition, that went to white musicians. Goodman made $200,000 per year in 1938. That's $4.4 million today. Fletcher Henderson, the man who wrote Goodman's arrangements, made $5,000 per year. Goodman made 40 times more than the black genius who created his sound. The same pattern everywhere. Elvis Presley would later be called the king of rock and roll, a genre invented by black musicians. Pat Boone would cover Little Richard's songs, make them safe for white audiences, and outsell the originals 10-1. Every major American musical form, jazz, blues, rock and roll, R&B, hip-hop, would be invented by black artists and commercialized by white performers. And it started in Harlem in the 1930s. The Renaissance created something extraordinary, and white America took it, removed the black faces, and called it theirs. Duke Ellington understood this. In 1938, he gave an interview where he said, "Jazz is black music. It came from black culture, black history, black pain, and black joy. But America doesn't want to acknowledge that. They want the music without the people who made it. They want the culture without the humanity. So they take our sound, give it to white musicians, and pretend we never existed, and there's nothing we can do about it. Because we don't control the recording studios, we don't control the radio stations, we don't control the distribution. We just create, and they take." That was the final death of the Renaissance. Not poverty, not violence, not mob control. Theft. The systematic erasure of black creators from the culture they'd built. And Harlem? Harlem was left with the policy racket, the nightclubs that served white tourists, and a growing sense that the golden age was gone forever. Bumpy Johnson was making $500,000 per year, living in a brownstone on Edgecombe Avenue, wearing custom suits, driving a Cadillac. But he knew what had been lost. He'd seen the Renaissance at its peak, seen the moment when Harlem controlled its own culture and economy, and now he was managing that culture's exploitation on behalf of the Italian mob. He justified it the same way Holstein and St. Clair had justified their policy operations. Better me than someone worse. Better 40% to Luciano than 70% to Schultz. Better black managers running the day-to-day than white gangsters directly controlling everything. It's not independence, but it's survival. And then, in 1936, Lucky Luciano got arrested. Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor Schultz had wanted to kill, had built a case against Luciano. Not for murder, not for bootlegging, not for policy gambling, for running a prostitution ring. Dewey couldn't prove the murders, couldn't trace the policy money, couldn't connect Luciano to the violence. But prostitution. He had witnesses. He had evidence. He had testimony. In June 1936, Lucky Luciano was convicted on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in state prison. The most powerful gangster in New York, gone. Bumpy Johnson's protector was in prison. And the deal they'd made? It transferred to Frank Costello, Luciano's underboss, who took over the organization. Costello honored the arrangement, but the relationship was different. Costello didn't trust Bumpy the way Luciano had. The partnership became more transactional, less personal. But Bumpy adapted. He always adapted. By 1940, he was still running Harlem's policy racket, still making hundreds of thousands per year, still the most powerful black gangster in New York. But the world was changing. War was coming. And that war would transform Harlem one more time. The Savoy Ballroom, 1938, the last symbol of what Harlem had been. While the Cotton Club had moved downtown, While Small's Paradise had sold to white owners, while the Renaissance had scattered and died, the Savoy endured, still integrated, still managed by Charles Buchanan, still home to the greatest dancers and the greatest music in American jazz. Chick Webb was at his peak. Webb had been the Savoy's house band leader since 1927. By 1938, he'd built the most powerful swing orchestra in the country. 15 musicians, arrangements by Edgar Sampson and Benny Carter, and Webb himself on drums. The most dynamic, driving, unstoppable drummer in jazz. Webb was a physical marvel. He was 4 feet tall, hunchbacked from tuberculosis of the spine, and weighed maybe 80 pounds. He sat on a raised platform so he could reach his drums, had custom pedals built because his legs were too short for standard equipment. He looked fragile. He played like thunder. The Savoy's battle of the band's format had made Webb a legend. Visiting orchestras would challenge the house band, and Webb would destroy them. Count Basie came in 1937 with his Kansas City Orchestra, widely considered the hardest swinging band in America. Webb's band crushed them. Basie later said, "I couldn't believe it. We brought our A game, and Chick Webb just overwhelmed us. I've never heard a band play harder, or a drummer play stronger. He didn't just beat us, he made us look amateur." The Savoy in 1938 was doing 7,000 people on Saturday nights. 7,000. The fire marshal constantly threatened to shut them down for overcrowding, but Charles Buchanan had enough political connections and paid enough in bribes to stay open. And the Lindy Hop was at its peak. Frankie Manning, Norma Miller, Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. These dancers were performing feats of athletic brilliance that wouldn't be matched for decades. The Lindy Hop had evolved from a street dance to an art form. Dancers were throwing their partners 6 feet in the air, catching them, spinning them, creating shapes with their bodies that defied physics. And critically, the Savoy was still integrated. Black and white dancers on the same floor. Not just tolerating each other, dancing together, partnering, creating together. In 1938, America, where segregation was law in the South and practice in the North, the Savoy was a radical space. But that radicalism made it a target. The white establishment had tolerated the Savoy when it was a curiosity, when it was contained, when it was in Harlem, where white people didn't have to see it unless they chose to slum. But by 1938, the Savoy's reputation had spread. It was written about in newspapers, featured in magazines, talked about on radio. It was no longer a secret, and that visibility made it dangerous. In 1939, the Catholic Church's campaign against the Savoy intensified. Father Edward Lodge Curran, a prominent Brooklyn priest, gave sermons about the moral decay of interracial dancing. He called the Savoy a breeding ground for race mixing and demanded the city shut it down. The campaign was explicitly racist. Nobody was calling for the closure of white-only nightclubs where sexual impropriety was just as common. But an integrated dance hall where black and white bodies moved together? That was intolerable. Charles Buchanan fought back. He wrote editorials in the Amsterdam News defending the Savoy as a positive institution that promoted racial harmony. He got endorsements from clergy, community leaders, even some white liberals. He argued that the Savoy was doing exactly what America claimed to stand for, bringing people together across racial lines. It didn't matter, because the campaign wasn't really about morality. It was about control. White society was uncomfortable with a black-managed space where white women danced with black men, where racial boundaries were crossed, where the social order was challenged. The Savoy had to be neutralized. In April 1940, the New York City Department of Health announced that the Savoy Ballroom was being investigated for violations of the sanitary code. The specific allegation: the Savoy was a center for prostitution and venereal disease transmission. This was a lie. There was no evidence. No arrests for prostitution at the Savoy. No documented cases of disease transmission. But the accusation didn't need to be true. It just needed to be public. On April 21st, 1940, the city ordered the Savoy closed. Padlocked. The stated reason: a public health menace. The real reason: interracial dancing. The black community erupted. The Amsterdam News ran front-page headlines. Savoy closure is racial attack. Protests were organized. Petitions circulated. Over 10,000 people signed demands to reopen the ballroom. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the newly elected city councilman from Harlem, gave speeches calling the closure naked racism disguised as public health. It didn't work. The Savoy stayed closed for 16 months. When it finally reopened in October 1941, the damage was done. The momentum was broken. The dancers had scattered. Chick Webb was dead. He'd died in June 1939 at age 34, tuberculosis finally killing him. The big bands that had made the Savoy famous were touring nationally and didn't need it anymore. The Savoy reopened to much smaller crowds. It would stay open until 1958, but it was never the same. The closure in 1940 was the symbolic death of the Harlem Renaissance. The last institution that represented what Harlem had been, integrated, joyful, culturally generative, had been destroyed by white authority for being exactly those things. Frankie Manning, the Lindy Hop dancer, later said, "When they closed the Savoy in 1940, they weren't just closing a dance hall. They were closing a vision of what America could be. For 2 hours on a Saturday night, we lived in a world where race didn't matter, where the only thing that mattered was whether you could dance. And America couldn't tolerate that. They killed it because it was possible, because we proved integration could work, because we showed that the racial order was artificial, unnecessary, destructive, and that was more dangerous than any crime we could have committed." The Savoy's closure coincided with another transformation, World War II, and that war would change everything about Harlem, about black consciousness, about the relationship between black gangsters and black communities. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, America enters World War II, and within months, 500,000 black men would enlist or be drafted into the armed forces. The war transformed Black America's relationship with the nation. Black soldiers served in segregated units, were given the worst assignments, faced discrimination in the military just as they did in civilian life. But they also saw the world. They fought in Europe, in Asia, in the Pacific, and they saw societies that weren't segregated. They saw French civilians treating them with respect. They saw Italian women who didn't fear them. They saw that American racism wasn't natural law, it was an American choice. When those soldiers came home, they came back different, less willing to accept discrimination, less afraid, more militant. And Harlem? Harlem had already been militant, already been angry. The war made that anger organized, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about what the war did to Harlem's economy, specifically the nightlife and the criminal underworld. World War II was good for business. The wartime economy brought jobs, factories that built planes, ships, ammunition. They needed workers. Black unemployment in Harlem dropped from 50% in 1940 to 15% by 1943. People had money again, not wealth, but income. Enough to eat, pay rent, and yes, play policy. The policy racket exploded during the war. Bumpy Johnson's operation went from collecting $200,000 per week in 1940 to $400,000 per week by 1944. Why? Because people had more money to bet, and because wartime created anxiety. Husbands, sons, brothers overseas fighting. Families at home praying they'd come back. Policy sold hope. Bet a dime, maybe win $6. Maybe that $6 is a sign your son will survive. Bumpy Johnson was making $1 million per year personally by 1944. That's $17 million in today's money. He was the richest black man in Harlem, possibly the richest black man in New York. He lived on Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill, the neighborhood where the black elite lived. His neighbors were doctors, lawyers, entertainers. He fit right in. Except they made their money legally, and he didn't. But the war also changed the nightlife. The clubs that had served white slummers in the 1930s, they now served. The Apollo Theater became the center of Harlem's wartime culture. It had opened in 1934, but during the war, it became the premier venue for black entertainment. Every Wednesday night was amateur night, where unknown performers could compete for a cash prize. This is where Ella Fitzgerald got discovered in 1934, Sarah Vaughan in 1942, James Brown in 1956 after the war. The Apollo proved that Harlem still had cultural generative power. It just wasn't funded by gangsters anymore. It was commercial, professionalized, sanitized. And the music was changing too. Swing was dying. The big band era was ending, partially because of the war. Musicians were getting drafted. Traveling was restricted. The economics of touring a 15-piece orchestra became impossible. But something new was emerging: bebop. In the early 1940s, young musicians like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, and Bud Powell started playing after-hour sessions at clubs like Minton's Playhouse on 118th Street. They were inventing a new style of jazz that was faster, more complex, more aggressive than swing. Bebop couldn't be danced to easily. It wasn't meant for white audiences. It was music for musicians, by musicians. Bebop was also resistance. The swing era had seen black music appropriated by white bandleaders who made millions. Bebop was designed to be uncopyable. The tempos were too fast, the harmonies too complex, the improvisations too challenging. You couldn't learn bebop from sheet music. You had to be there, in the clubs, learning from the masters. And those clubs, they were in Harlem. Black spaces, for black musicians, creating black art that white America couldn't steal as easily. Charlie Parker said in 1945, "They took jazz and made it swing, made it danceable, safe, profitable, made it white. Bebop is our music. They can't have it. It's too hard, too black, too true. Let them try." And white America did try. White musicians studied bebop. Some mastered it. But they never dominated it the way they dominated swing. Bebop remained predominantly black music, created and performed by black artists, for audiences that appreciated its complexity. It was a reclaiming of cultural ownership. But here's the contradiction. While bebop was emerging as artistically radical music, the economic structure of Harlem hadn't changed at all. Bumpy Johnson still ran the policy racket for the mob. The clubs were still mob-controlled. The money was still being extracted. And Bumpy was getting older. By 1945, he was 40. He'd been in the game for 25 years. He'd been shot 3 times, stabbed twice, arrested more than 30 times. He'd served 5 years in Sing Sing in the 1920s. He was tired. But he also understood something. The game was changing. The war had radicalized black consciousness. The soldiers coming home weren't going to accept the same old arrangements. They'd fought for democracy overseas. They wanted democracy at home. The civil rights movement was beginning. It wouldn't explode until the 1950s and 60s, but the seeds were planted in the 1940s. And Bumpy, who was many things but never stupid, understood that the era of black gangsters working for the white mob was ending. Not immediately, not violently, but ending. The next generation would demand more, would demand independence. In 1946, Bumpy Johnson met a young man from North Carolina named Frank Lucas. Lucas was 16, had just arrived in Harlem, fleeing a murder charge back home. He'd killed a white man who'd assaulted his cousin. Lucas was smart, fearless, and ambitious, everything Bumpy had been 20 years earlier. Bumpy took him under his wing, taught him the game, but more importantly, taught him to think strategically. "Don't just learn how to run policy," Bumpy told Lucas. "Learn why the system works the way it does. Learn who benefits, who loses, where the power actually sits. Because someday, maybe not in my lifetime, but in yours, there's going to be an opportunity to break free. And when that opportunity comes, you need to be ready." Frank Lucas listened, and 20 years later, he'd try to do exactly what Bumpy predicted: break free from the mob, build an independent operation, prove that black gangsters didn't need white partnerships. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. In 1945, the war ended. 500,000 black soldiers came home. The Renaissance was long dead. The Cotton Club was a tourist trap. The Savoy was diminished. Small's Paradise was white-owned. The policy racket was mob-controlled. But Harlem itself? Harlem was alive, angry, conscious of its power, and beginning to demand change. The music had transformed from swing to bebop. The politics had transformed from accommodation to militancy. The economics were still extractive, but the community was no longer ignorant of the extraction. Everyone knew the mob was taking millions. Everyone knew white America had stolen black culture. Everyone knew the system was designed to keep black people poor, while profiting from their creativity. What nobody knew yet was what to do about it. The civil rights movement would provide one answer: legal resistance, nonviolent protest, integration. But the criminal underworld would provide another answer, one that Frank Lucas would attempt in the 1960s. Economic independence through illegal means. Both answers would fail in different ways. But in 1945, those failures were decades away. For now, Harlem was in twilight. Not dead, but not alive in the way it had been. Waiting for the next transformation. Waiting for the next generation to try again. And sitting in a brownstone on Edgecombe Avenue, counting money from policy banks that funneled wealth out of Harlem as fast as it came in, Bumpy Johnson was thinking about the future. About Frank Lucas, the teenage kid he was mentoring. About whether the dream of independence, the dream Holstein and St. Clair had died for, whether that dream was possible at all. He didn't know. But he knew this: the game had changed. The Renaissance was over. And whatever came next, it would be different from anything that had come before. The Golden Age was dead. The war had ended, and Harlem was about to enter its longest, darkest period. The 1950s and 60s, when heroin would replace policy as the primary criminal enterprise, when the community would tear itself apart, when the dream of black cultural and economic power would come closer than ever before, and fail more catastrophically than anyone imagined. But that's Act 5. For now, in 1945, there was just exhaustion, survival, and the faint hope that maybe, somehow, the next generation would figure out what this one couldn't: how to be free. Let's talk about what happened to the culture the Harlem Renaissance created. Not what happened in Harlem. We've covered that. What happened to jazz, to swing, to the Lindy Hop, to the entire aesthetic vocabulary that Black Harlem invented between 1920 and 1940. What happened when white America took it? Benny Goodman plays Carnegie Hall. First jazz concert ever performed at that venue. Carnegie Hall, the temple of high culture, where classical music and opera belonged. And here's Benny Goodman, a white Jewish clarinetist from Chicago, playing jazz. And America calls it historic. The band includes 2 black musicians, Teddy Wilson on piano and Lionel Hampton on vibraphone. They're listed as special guests, not full band members. And the arrangements they're playing? Written by Fletcher Henderson, a black bandleader and arranger who'd been creating sophisticated swing music since 1924. Fletcher Henderson was the architect of big band swing. He invented the call and response patterns, the section playing, the orchestral arrangements that made swing music work. But Henderson couldn't keep his own band together. Financial problems, bad management, racism in the booking industry. In 1935, he started selling his arrangements to Benny Goodman. $50 per arrangement, sometimes $100. Goodman took those arrangements and became the king of swing. By 1938, he was making $200,000 per year. Was Goodman stealing? Not technically. He paid for the arrangements. He employed black musicians when most white band leaders wouldn't. He acknowledged his debt to Henderson publicly. But he also made 40 times more money than the black genius who created his sound. And America crowned him king of a music form black people had invented. This pattern repeated everywhere. Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Chick Webb, Jimmy Lunsford. These were the greatest band leaders in jazz. All black, all brilliant. They made decent livings by black standards. Then you had white band leaders: Goodman, Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Artie Shaw. They made fortunes, not because they were better musicians. They weren't, because they were white and America wanted jazz without the black faces. Glenn Miller's In the Mood, the most famous swing recording of all time, was adapted from a Joe Garland arrangement that had been recorded by Edgar Hayes, a black band leader, 2 years earlier. Miller heard it, bought the rights for cheap, recorded it, and it became his signature song. Hayes made nothing from it. Tommy Dorsey's entire style was copied from listening to black trombonists in Harlem clubs. He'd sit in the audience at the Savoy, at Small's Paradise, watching and learning. Then he'd take what he learned, perform it for white audiences, and get credited as innovative. And the Lindy Hop, the dance that was invented by black dancers at the Savoy, that Frankie Manning and Norma Miller perfected, that represented the pinnacle of American vernacular dance? White America renamed it, called it Jitterbug when white dancers performed it, sanitized it, removed the African movement vocabulary, made it safe, and then Hollywood put it in movies with all white casts, performing a whitewashed version of a black art form. By 1940, swing music was America's music. It was played on every radio station, performed in every dance hall, beloved by millions. And most white Americans had no idea it came from black culture. They thought it was just American music, universal, race neutral. Duke Ellington tried to fight this erasure. In 1941, he premiered Black, Brown, and Beige, a 45-minute orchestral suite about black American history. He performed it at Carnegie Hall, following Goodman's precedent. The piece was brilliant, ambitious, unapologetically black. It told the story from slavery to the present, through music. White critics destroyed it. They said jazz shouldn't be political, shouldn't be historical, should just entertain. One critic wrote, Duke Ellington should stick to 3-minute dance numbers and leave serious composition to serious composers. Translation: black musicians should entertain us, not educate us. Should make us dance, not think. Ellington was devastated. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove jazz was serious art, not just entertainment. He succeeded artistically. His sacred concerts, his suites, his compositions are now recognized as American masterpieces. But during his lifetime, white America wanted him to play Take the A Train and Smile. When he tried to do more, they told him to know his place. That's the theft. Not just the music itself, though that was stolen. The context, the meaning, the humanity of the creators. White America took black music and divorced it from black people, took the culture and erased the community that created it. And it wasn't just music. Language, fashion, dance, attitude. Everything Harlem created became American culture, stripped of its origins. The slang invented in Harlem rent parties? Cool, hip, dig it. The man. These became universal American expressions. Nobody remembers they came from black jazz musicians. The fashion, zoot suits, wide-brimmed hats, the whole aesthetic of 1940s cool, created by black Harlemites, then adopted by white hipsters who thought they'd invented it. The attitude, the knowing irony, the detachment, the performance of confidence, that's black survival strategy in a hostile world, turned into American masculinity without acknowledgement of its origins. Harlem created modern American culture, jazz, swing, bebop, the entire musical foundation, the Lindy Hop, which became the basis for all American social dancing, the speakeasy aesthetic that defined Prohibition, the nightclub culture that became standard entertainment, the integration of music, dance, and nightlife as a unified experience. All of it came from Harlem between 1920 and 1940. And white America took it, removed the black faces, and sold it back to itself as American culture. No attribution, no compensation, no acknowledgement. In 1960, a white sociologist named Norman Mailer wrote an essay called The White Negro about how white bohemians were adopting black cultural styles. He described it as white people becoming hip by imitating black coolness. The essay is fascinating because it acknowledges the theft while celebrating the thieves. Mailer understood that white hipsters were appropriating black culture, and he thought that was good. Thought it was progressive. Never once suggested that black people should be compensated or credited. That's the final insult. Not just stealing the culture, but being praised for it. Not just taking the music, but being called innovative for performing it. Not just erasing black creators, but denying the erasure ever happened. Langston Hughes wrote about this in 1951. He published a short story called Who's Passing for Who? The story is about racial passing, light-skinned black people presenting as white. But Hughes uses it as a metaphor for cultural passing. He writes, "White people can pass for colored, musically and artistically, but colored folks can't pass for white economically or socially. We create the culture, they reap the profits." That sentence captures everything. Black people created the Harlem Renaissance, created jazz, swing, bebop, created the Lindy Hop, the nightclub aesthetic, modern American cool. And white people profited from it. Not just financially, though they did. Culturally. White America built its cultural identity on black creativity while denying black humanity. And here's the thing. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic. The recording industry was white-owned. The radio stations were white-controlled. The booking agencies, the clubs, the distribution networks, all white. Black musicians could create, but they couldn't control the means of production or distribution. So white intermediaries took the music, packaged it, sold it, and kept most of the profit. Duke Ellington's compositions are worth hundreds of millions of dollars today. His catalog generates ongoing royalties from performances, recordings, films, and commercials. During his lifetime, he made maybe 10 million total, spread across 50 years. That's not nothing, but it's a fraction of what his music generated. The rest went to record companies, publishers, distributors. White-owned, white-controlled. The same for every black musician from that era. Bessie Smith died in 1937 after a car accident. She bled to death because the first hospital refused to treat a black woman. She'd sold millions of records, made Columbia Records rich. She died without adequate medical care and was buried in an unmarked grave that stayed unmarked for 33 years until Janis Joplin and Juanita Green paid for a headstone in 1970. That's what the theft meant, not just abstract cultural appropriation. Concrete material consequences. Black artists dying in poverty while their music made white executives wealthy. Zora Neale Hurston died in 1960 in a welfare home in Florida. She was working as a maid in her final years. She'd published novels, folklore collections, anthropological research. She'd created foundational works of American literature, and she died cleaning someone else's house for pennies. The Harlem Renaissance created permanent contributions to American culture, and the people who created it were discarded, used up, thrown away, forgotten, and their creations were repackaged as universal American art with no black fingerprints visible. By 1960, jazz was taught in conservatories. The Lindy Hop was performed by professional dance companies. Swing was nostalgic music played by white musicians for aging white audiences. And the black Harlemites who'd invented all of it, either dead, forgotten, or marginalized in their own art form. That's the cost of the theft. Not just the money, though the money mattered, the erasure, the systematic removal of black people from the culture they created, and the psychological impact of watching your creativity stolen, watching white people profit from it, and being told you should be grateful they're paying attention at all. Duke Ellington never stopped fighting this. Until he died in 1974, he insisted that jazz was black music, that its history mattered, that the creators deserved recognition. He won that argument eventually. Now we acknowledge jazz's black origins. But he didn't live to see it widely accepted. And most of the Renaissance creators didn't get even that. They died in obscurity, their contributions forgotten, their names unknown. The culture they created lives on. They don't. That's what theft means when we're talking about cultural theft. Not metaphor. Actual erasure, actual poverty, actual death while your creations make others wealthy. The Harlem Renaissance built American culture, and America responded by taking everything and giving back nothing. But let's talk about the other cost, the one nobody wants to discuss. Not the theft by white America, That's external. That's oppression. Let's talk about the internal cost. What the criminal underworld did to Harlem itself. The policy racket. Let's do the math honestly. Between 1920 and 1950, the numbers game in Harlem processed approximately $300 million in bets. That's in period currency. In today's money, $6 billion. $6 billion in bets placed by the poorest black neighborhood in America over 30 years. The payout rate was 60%. So of that $6 billion, $3.6 billion was paid out in winnings. The remaining $2.4 billion, that was profit, divided between operators, the mob, politicians, police. Where did that $2.4 billion come from? Domestic workers betting their last nickel. Factory workers betting their lunch money. Mothers betting the grocery budget. People betting money they needed for food, rent, medicine. Betting because they were desperate, because they had no other path to financial stability, because the system was designed to keep them poor, and policy offered the only hope of escape. And the math was rigged against them. True odds of hitting a 3-digit number, 1 in 1,000. Payout, 600 to 1. The house kept 40% of every dollar bet, guaranteed. If you played policy long term, you lost. Mathematically impossible to win. But desperation doesn't understand mathematics. Let's be specific about what that meant. 1935, the height of the Depression. Average Harlem family income, $32 per month. Average rent, $60 per month. The math didn't work. You couldn't survive legally. So people played policy. On average, Harlem families spent $5 per month on policy bets. That's 15% of their income. Money that could have been saved, invested, used for food or clothing or education. Multiply that across 30 years. The average Harlem family, over a generation, bet $1,800 on policy. Lost $1,000 net. That's $24,000 in today's money. Lost money. Gone. Into the pockets of gangsters and the mob. Now, multiply across the whole community. 50,000 families betting for 30 years. $50 million in net losses. $1.2 billion today. That's wealth that could have built businesses, funded education, created generational stability. Instead, it disappeared into the policy machine. And here's the part that makes it even worse. Some of that money funded the Renaissance. Casper Holstein's grants to Langston Hughes, that was policy money. The Dark Tower parties, policy money. The nightclubs, the culture, the art, all funded by extracting wealth from the poorest people in Harlem. So we're faced with an impossible question. Was it worth it? Would we trade the Harlem Renaissance for those $50 million staying in working class pockets? Would we give up Langston Hughes' poetry if it meant families could afford food? Would we sacrifice Duke Ellington's music if it meant children could have shoes? There's no good answer. Both things are true simultaneously. The Renaissance was beautiful, revolutionary, important, and it was funded by exploitation. You can't separate them. Casper Holstein knew this. We talked about his justification earlier. If I shut down tomorrow, someone else would take my place. That's true, but it's also evasion. Yes, someone else would have run policy, but Holstein chose to be that someone, chose to take the money, chose to fund artists with money extracted from people who couldn't afford to lose it. Does his funding of black culture offset the harm? Maybe partially. Langston Hughes' poetry has value beyond dollars. His words have inspired generations, given voice to black experience, changed American literature. That wouldn't have happened without Holstein's money, but it also wouldn't have happened at the cost it did. And the Renaissance wasn't the only thing the policy money funded. It funded violence. Between 1930 and 1940, at least 300 people were murdered in policy-related violence. Collectors who skimmed, runners who switched sides, rivals who competed, innocent people caught in crossfire, 300 families destroyed because of an illegal lottery. It funded police corruption, $20,000 per month to the NYPD, remember? That's $5 million over the 30-year period. $5 million that could have gone to community services, that instead went to cops who brutalized black Harlemites, paid to look the other way on policy, but also to look the other way on everything else. Police corruption enabled by policy money meant justice was impossible in Harlem. It funded political corruption. Jimmy Hines took $500,000 per year from Schultz. Over a decade, $5 million. That money bought elections, controlled judges, shaped policy, and it meant Harlem had no real political representation. Ferdinand Q. Morton was Tammany's puppet, delivering votes in exchange for patronage, while the real power stayed downtown with white bosses who profited from Harlem's exploitation. And it created a culture of crime as entrepreneurship. For young black men growing up in 1930s, Harlem, what were the role models? Not doctors. There were some, but they were rare. Not lawyers. Even rarer. Not businessmen. Black businesses were systematically denied loans and licenses. The visible success stories were gangsters. Bumpy Johnson in a three-piece suit driving a Cadillac, living on Sugar Hill. Casper Holstein throwing parties with champagne. Stephanie St. Clair wearing furs and jewelry. These were the people who had money, power, respect, and they got it through crime. So the next generation learned, crime pays. Legal work doesn't. The system is rigged. The only path to success is outside the law. That lesson would haunt Harlem for generations. Frank Lucas, who Bumpy mentored in the 1940s, absorbed that lesson completely. He saw Bumpy living well through illegal means and thought, this is the path. In the 1960s, Lucas would build a heroin empire that devastated Harlem far worse than policy ever did. And he justified it the same way Holstein and Bumpy did. The system doesn't give us legal options. This is survival. But heroin wasn't policy. Policy was gambling. Harmful, exploitative, but not immediately deadly. Heroin killed. Destroyed lives. Destroyed families. Destroyed entire communities. And the infrastructure for distributing heroin, built by the policy racket, the networks, the street-level dealers, the corruption, the acceptance of criminality, all of it established by policy, repurposed for narcotics. By 1970, Harlem was a war zone. Heroin addiction rates over 50% in some neighborhoods. Crime skyrocketing. Families torn apart. And if you trace the lineage, it goes back to the policy racket of the 1920s and 30s. Not directly, policy didn't cause heroin, but it normalized criminal economics, created the infrastructure, taught generations that illegal enterprise was acceptable. That's the cost nobody wants to calculate. Not just the money extracted from poor families. Not just the murders, the corruption, the exploitation, the long-term cultural cost, the normalization of criminality, the destruction of legal entrepreneurship, the message sent to every young black person that the only path to success was outside the law. And for what? Some great art, some cultural contributions, some moments of joy and beauty and transcendence. Were they worth it? I don't know. Nobody knows. There's no way to calculate that equation. You can't weigh Langston Hughes' poems against 1,000 families losing their grocery money. You can't balance Duke Ellington's music against the 300 murder victims. You can't quantify the Harlem Renaissance's cultural impact versus the decades of criminal infrastructure that followed. Both things are true. The Renaissance was magnificent, and it was built on bones. So what are we left with? What did the Harlem Renaissance underworld actually build that lasted? Let's start with the culture, the permanent contributions that nobody can take away, even if they stole credit for them. Jazz, America's only original art form, invented in New Orleans, perfected in Chicago, brought to maturity in Harlem. Duke Ellington, Chick Webb, Count Basie, they created sophisticated orchestral music that rivals anything in the classical tradition. Bebop came next. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk. Then cool jazz, hard bop, modal jazz, free jazz, fusion. An unbroken line of innovation, all rooted in what was created in Harlem between 1920 and 1945. Jazz is now taught in conservatories worldwide, studied by musicologists, performed in concert halls. It's recognized as serious art, as American classical music, and it all came from rent parties, speakeasies, and mob-controlled nightclubs in Harlem. The Lindy Hop, the first American vernacular dance form to be recognized globally as an art. It's taught in dance schools on every continent. There are international competitions, professional companies, historical preservation efforts. Frankie Manning, who invented the aerial moves in 1936, lived to see the Lindy Hop revived in the 1980s and 90s. He taught thousands of dancers before dying in 2009 at age 94. The dance he created at the Savoy is now permanent. The literature. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen. Their works are taught in schools, anthologized, studied, celebrated. Hughes is recognized as one of America's greatest poets. Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God is considered a masterpiece of American fiction. The literature survives, even if the writers died in poverty. The nightclub culture. Before Harlem, nightlife was saloons and brothels. After Harlem, nightlife meant live music, dancing, food, drinks, entertainment, all integrated into one experience. That model became standard. Every nightclub in America, every music venue, every entertainment space is descended from what Harlem created in the 1920s. The aesthetic of cool, the detached confidence, the ironic awareness, the performance of effortlessness. That's Harlem. That's Duke Ellington in a tuxedo, playing music that sounds easy but isn't. That's Billie Holiday singing Heartbreak like it doesn't hurt. That's Miles Davis turning his back on the audience because he doesn't need their approval. Cool is black culture, created in Harlem, now universal. Those are the permanent cultural contributions. Real, lasting, important. American culture is unimaginable without them. But there are other legacies. Darker ones. The criminal infrastructure. The policy racket never went away. It just got legalized. New York State created a legal lottery in 1967. Same game, same odds, same mathematical structure. Except now the state runs it, and the profits fund education instead of gangsters. Or at least that's the theory. In practice, lotteries still target poor neighborhoods, still extract wealth from people who can't afford it, still sell false hope. The state just took over the Operation Holstein and St. Clair had built. The political machine. Tammany Hall is dead, but the model survives. Urban political machines that deliver services in exchange for votes, that operate through patronage and corruption, that maintain power by controlling just enough resources to keep people dependent. That's descended directly from the Jimmy Hines model. It's how city politics still works in many places. The normalization of criminality. The idea that illegal enterprise is acceptable, even admirable, if the system doesn't offer legal alternatives. That's Harlem's legacy too. And it's complicated because there's truth in it. The system was rigged. Legal options were blocked. Survival required illegal means. But it also created generations who saw crime as first resort, not last resort. Who saw violence as normal. Who never tried legal entrepreneurship because they'd learned it was pointless. The glorification of gangsters. Every mob movie, every gangster rap album, every celebration of outlaw culture. That's descended from Harlem. From the image of Bumpy Johnson in his suit, Stephanie St. Clair in her furs, Casper Holstein throwing parties. The gangster as folk hero, as community protector, as Robin Hood figure. That mythology started in Harlem, spread through black culture, then became universal American mythology. And it's done incalculable harm by teaching young people that crime is glamorous, that violence is respectable, that exploitation is acceptable if you're oppressed. So what's the final balance? What did the Harlem Renaissance Underworld build? It built American culture, jazz, swing, bebop, the Lindy Hop, modern nightlife, cool as an aesthetic, the entire foundation of American entertainment. That's not hyperbole. That's documented history. It built criminal infrastructure that both harmed and served the community. The policy racket extracted wealth, but also employed thousands. The nightclubs exploited artists, but also gave them platforms. The gangsters corrupted politics, but also provided some services the state refused to provide. It built a mythology that's both true and false. True. Black people created something extraordinary under impossible circumstances. False. Crime was the only way, violence was necessary, exploitation was justified. It built a legacy we're still grappling with. Still trying to honor the culture while acknowledging the cost. Still trying to celebrate the artists while recognizing the exploitation. Still trying to understand how something so beautiful could come from something so destructive. Here's what I believe after examining this history. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't possible without the criminal underworld. The money had to come from somewhere, and legal sources weren't available. White patrons demanded stereotypes. Black gangsters offered money with fewer strings attached. The artists took what they could get and created miracles. But also, the cost was devastating and ongoing. Families destroyed, wealth extracted, violence normalized, criminal infrastructure that enabled worse crimes later, political corruption that prevented real reform, a culture that glorified illegality and made legal success seem impossible. Both things are true. You can't say the Renaissance justified the crime. You also can't say the crime negates the culture. They're inseparable. The music, the literature, the dance, they're real contributions to human culture, and they were built on exploitation, funded by desperation, made possible by criminality. Langston Hughes understood this. In his later years, he was asked about the Harlem Renaissance and whether it succeeded. His answer: we created art that will outlive us. We also lived in poverty, died in obscurity, and watched white America steal everything we made. So did we succeed? Yes and no. Both and neither. We did what we could with what we had. History will judge whether it was enough. That's the only honest answer. The Harlem Renaissance underworld built something magnificent and terrible, created beauty from ugliness, made art from crime, gave the world jazz while taking from the poorest people in America. And the legacy? It's everything. American culture is the legacy. Jazz, hip-hop, rock, and roll, R&B, all descended from Harlem. The nightclub, the concert venue, the music festival, all descended from the Cotton Club and the Savoy. Cool, swagger, style, attitude, all descended from Harlem gangsters and musicians who performed confidence they didn't always feel. But also, the war on drugs, the school-to-prison pipeline, the glorification of gangster culture, the normalization of violence, the destruction of urban communities. That's legacy too. Not all of it traces to Harlem, but some of it does. The infrastructure was built there. The mythology was created there. So when you listen to jazz, when you dance, when you consume any aspect of American entertainment culture, you're experiencing the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance underworld. The music that came from rent parties where families bet their last dollar. The dance that came from the Savoy, funded by mob money. The cool that came from gangsters trying to survive in a hostile world. It's beautiful. It's terrible. It's both, and we'll never untangle them because they're the same thing. The Harlem Renaissance proved that black people could create world-changing culture under any circumstances, even the most oppressive. It also proved that culture alone doesn't free you, that creating beauty doesn't end exploitation, that art doesn't pay the rent or feed children or build generational wealth. The gangsters proved that black people could build economic empires without white permission. They also proved that those empires couldn't be sustained, couldn't be made legitimate, couldn't protect their communities from greater forces. And the mob proved what we already knew, that white supremacy adapts. When black people built their own economy, white gangsters took it over. When black people created their own culture, white performers appropriated it. When black people demanded respect, the system found new ways to extract and exploit. That's the legacy, triumph and tragedy, beauty and exploitation, creation and theft, all inseparable, all true, all permanent. Casper Holstein died in 1944, broke and forgotten. Stephanie St. Clair died in 1969, bitter and alone. Oni Madden retired to Arkansas, lived peacefully until 1965. Duke Ellington played until he died in 1974. Never stopped creating. Never got the recognition he deserved in his lifetime. Langston Hughes died in 1967, celebrated as a great poet. Never wealthy. Zora Neale Hurston died in 1960, working as a maid, buried in an unmarked grave. The Savoy Ballroom was demolished in 1958, torn down to build a housing project that still stands. There's a plaque on the building now, commemorating what was there. Tourists sometimes stop to read it. Nobody dances. The Cotton Club closed in 1940 when the building was demolished. It reopened in different locations over the years, each time a pale imitation of what it had been. The current Cotton Club, opened in 1978 in Harlem, has no connection to the original except the name. Small's Paradise closed in 1986. The building still exists. Houses a church now. Nobody remembers it was once the most important black-owned nightclub in Harlem. The policy racket ended when the state took it over. The numbers game is now the lottery, generating billions for state governments, still targeting poor neighborhoods, still extracting wealth from people who can't afford it. Same game, different owner. Harlem itself, still there, gentrifying now, ironically. White people moving in, paying high rents for the historical cachet of living where the Renaissance happened. The black families who created that culture, mostly displaced, priced out, scattered to the Bronx and Brooklyn and beyond. That's the final irony. Harlem created American culture, and America is now erasing Harlem. The neighborhood that gave the world jazz is becoming a museum of its own history, inhabited by people with no connection to what happened there. But the culture survives. The music plays on. People still dance the Lindy Hop. Students still read Langston Hughes. Musicians still study Duke Ellington. The culture outlived the people who created it, outlived the neighborhood that birthed it, outlived the criminal underworld that funded it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's victory. The culture is permanent. The beauty is real. The art transcends its origins. Jazz doesn't belong to gangsters or the mob or even to Harlem anymore. It belongs to the world, and the world is better for it. But we should remember the cost. Remember the families who lost their grocery money. Remember the musicians who died in poverty. Remember the dancers whose artistry was stolen. Remember the writers who cleaned houses to survive. Remember that every beautiful thing came from ugly circumstances, that every triumph was paid for with sacrifice, that nothing was free. They said black culture would never matter, that jazz was noise, that black performers were novelties, that Harlem was a slum with nothing to offer. They were wrong. Harlem gave America its culture, its music, its style, its soul. But the people who built that culture, they paid a terrible price. And the community that created it, it was destroyed in the process. That's the truth. Both parts. The beauty and the cost. The triumph and the tragedy. The legacy we inherited, and the bill that's still being paid. The Harlem Renaissance underworld built American culture, and it destroyed itself in the process. Both things are true. Both things matter. And we'll never be able to separate them because they're the same story, told from different angles, about people trying to survive and create and build something that would outlast them. They succeeded. The culture is permanent. The cost was devastating, and we're still living with both. That's the legacy. That's what they built. Everything.